Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadow of humanity's darkest chapter, a time when death walked openly through every street, knocked on every door, and claimed nearly half the known world. You're standing in a 14th century European city, and the air itself feels thick with dread. The morning bells that once called people to prayer now toll endlessly for the dead. You can smell the smoke from burning bodies, mixing with incense from desperate prayers, while rats scurry boldly through abandoned market stalls, where vendors will never return. Picture this. You're watching neighbors you've known your entire life develop mysterious black swellings the size of apples under their arms, then collapse. Within days, sometimes hours. The lucky ones die quickly. The unlucky ones, well, you probably won't survive this particular history lesson if you were actually living through it. This is the Black Death, and it didn't just kill people, it rewrote civilization itself, Doc. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little global community of insomniacs and history lovers gathering together in the quiet hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're about to witness how a microscopic bacterium brought the mighty medieval world to its knees, forever changing everything from labor laws to religious beliefs, from art to architecture. But here's the thing about the Black Death. It moves slowly, methodically, like a patient predator stalking its prey across continents and decades. The year is 1347, and you're a merchant in the bustling port city of Kaffa, located on the Black Sea in what's now Ukraine. The city thrives on trade routes connecting Europe to Asia, and you've grown wealthy, facilitating the exchange of silk, spices, and silver. Life is good until the Mongols arrive. You watch from the city walls as the Golden Horde sets up their siege engines, preparing for what everyone assumes will be a typical medieval siege. Months pass. The Mongols seem strangely lethargic, their attacks half-hearted. Then you notice something disturbing. Bodies being loaded onto catapults. Not just any bodies, corpses covered in black boils, their faces twisted in agony. The Mongols are launching their dead over your walls. This is humanity's first recorded instance of biological warfare, and you're witnessing the birth of a pandemic that will reshape the world. Those corpses carry Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that's been quietly brewing in the steppes of Central Asia for decades. The Mongols, unknowingly infected themselves, are essentially gift-wrapping death and delivering it straight to your doorstep. Within days, people in Kaffa start developing the same symptoms as the Mongol corpses. The siege breaks as the Mongols retreat, not in defeat, but because too many of their own are dying. But the damage is done. You're now part of patient zero for Europe's apocalypse. Here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue whether those catapulted corpses actually caused the outbreak in Kaffa, or if the plague was already spreading through natural means. Some scholars suggest the dramatic corpse flinging was more psychological warfare than effective disease transmission. But regardless of the exact mechanism, Kaffa becomes ground zero for the plague's westward march. You decide to flee the city, joining other merchants aboard ships bound for Constantinople, Genoa, and other Mediterranean ports. It seems like a smart move. Get away from the infected city, return to familiar territories. What you don't realize is that you're not escaping the plague, you're spreading it. those ships become floating coffins, carrying the Black Death. To every port they touch, the journey across the Black Sea takes weeks, and during that time, you watch fellow passengers develop the telltale symptoms. First comes the fever, accompanied by chills that make you feel like you're freezing and burning simultaneously. Then the headache-splitting pain. It feels like someone's driving nails through your skull. Your muscles ache as if you've been beaten with clubs, but it's the buboes that truly terrify everyone. These swellings, typically appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck, start as tender lumps, but quickly grow to the size of chicken eggs or even apples. They're not just painful, they're horrifying to look at, often turning black or dark purple, giving the disease one of its many names, the Black Death. Some passengers develop a different variant of the plague. Instead of buboes, they cough up blood, their lungs filling with fluid as the infection attacks their respiratory system. This pneumonic plague spreads even faster than the bubonic form, transmitted through droplets in the air every time someone coughs or sneezes. You realize with growing horror that simply breathing the same air as an infected person can seal your fate by the time your ship reaches Genoa in late 1347. Half the passengers are dead, and the other half are dying. The Genoese authorities, seeing the floating morgue approaching their harbor, try to turn the ship away. But it's too late. Some crew members have already made it to shore, and the plague begins its relentless spread through one of Europe's most important commercial centers. You're witnessing the beginning of what will become known as the Second Pandemic, the first being the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, and the third being the outbreak that began in China in the 1850s. But this second wave will prove to be the most devastating, ultimately killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. That the speed of the plague spread defies medieval understanding of disease. In an age when the fastest communication travels at the speed of a galloping horse, the Black Death moves like wildfire. From Genoa, it radiates outward along trade routes, following the very networks that have brought prosperity to medieval Europe. You watch as the plague reaches Marseille by January 1348 and creeps northward through France. By summer, it's devastating. Paris, where chroniclers report that 800 people die daily. The disease doesn't discriminate. It kills peasants and nobles, priests and merchants, young and old with equal enthusiasm. Even Pope Clement VI's personal physician succumbs to the plague, despite having access to the best medical knowledge of the time. Here's a quirky detail that might seem almost comical if it weren't so tragic. Medieval physicians, desperate to understand and treat the plague, developed increasingly bizarre theories about its causes. Some blamed corrupted air caused by unusual planetary alignments. Others pointed to earthquakes releasing poisonous vapors from the Earth's core. A few even suggested that the plague was caused by Jews poisoning wells, a conspiracy theory. That led to horrific massacres across Europe. The medical treatments were equally absurd. Physicians recommended everything from drinking ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, to sitting in sewers to counteract the bad air. Some doctors advised patients to wear amulets made from powdered emeralds or to surround themselves with pleasant smells to ward off the disease. The wealthy paid fortunes for theriac, a supposed cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh and opium. But perhaps the most telling response was the emergence of flagellants, groups of religious extremists who believed The plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. You encounter these processions as they move from town to town, their members stripping to the waist and whipping themselves bloody while chanting prayers and hymns. They believe that by inflicting pain upon themselves, they can appease divine wrath and end the pandemic. The flagellant movement reveals something crucial about medieval society's response to the Black Death. When rational explanations fail, people turn to increasingly extreme spiritual solutions. The plague isn't just killing bodies. It's shattering the medieval worldview that saw disease as either divine punishment or natural imbalance that could be corrected through proper treatment. As 1348 progresses, you witness the plague's arrival in England, carried across the English Channel by infected sailors. The disease lands first in the port of Melcombe Regis, now Weymouth, in June, and spreads rapidly through the English countryside. By autumn, it reaches London, where it will kill an estimated 60% of the population that the English experience with. The Black Death provides some of our most detailed contemporary accounts of the pandemic's impact. You read chronicles describing streets littered with corpses, mass graves that can't be dug fast enough, and the complete breakdown of normal social structures. In some villages, so many people die that there's no one left to bury the dead or tend the fields. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The massive death toll, while catastrophic in human terms, begins to create opportunities for survivors. With so many people dead, labor becomes scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants who survive the plague find themselves in a position to demand higher wages and better working conditions. The rigid feudal system that has dominated European society for centuries starts to crack under the pressure of demographic collapse. You're witnessing the birth of what historians call the Golden Age of Bacteria, a period when microorganisms wielded more power over human civilization than any king or emperor. But you're also seeing the seeds of profound social change that will eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in the late 1340s, you're simply trying to survive in a world where death stalks every street corner, where traditional authorities have lost their power to protect or explain, and where the very foundations of civilization seem to be crumbling. The plague has only just begun its work, and its full impact won't be understood for generations. The most chilling aspect of the Black Death isn't just its mortality rate. It's the speed with which it transforms everything familiar into something alien and terrifying. You wake up one morning in a world you recognize, and by evening, that world has become a nightmare where the rules of normal life no longer apply. Asterisk, you're standing in the port of Genoa in October 1347, watching 12 galleys limp into the harbor like wounded animals seeking shelter. These ships have sailed from Caffa, carrying what remains of the Genoese trading colony that fled the Mongol siege. But something is terribly wrong with these vessels. They're sailing erratically, and you can see bodies being thrown overboard. Even as they approach the docks, the harbor master, a practical man named Antonio di Credenza, initially welcomes the returning merchants. Genoa has grown wealthy from Eastern trade, and these ships represent significant investment and potential profit. But as the first sailors stumble onto the docks, their skin burning with fever and mysterious swellings bulging from their necks, Antonio realizes he's witnessing something unprecedented. Within hours, the decision is made to expel the ships from the harbor, but it's already too late. Several crew members have made it into the city, and some have even been taken to local hospitals run by religious orders. The plague has found its foothold in Western Europe, and from this single point of entry, it will spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. You follow the plague's path as it radiates outward from Genoa, along the Mediterranean coast. The disease travels with merchants, pilgrims, and refugees, each group unknowingly carrying death to new communities. By December 1347, the plague has reached Marseille, France's largest Mediterranean port, where it begins its devastating march through the French countryside. The French experience with the Black Death provides some of our most detailed contemporary accounts, thanks to chroniclers like Jean de Venette and the anonymous author of the Chronique de la Peste. You read their descriptions of streets filled with corpses, mass graves that can't be dug fast enough, and the complete breakdown of normal social order. In Paris, the death toll becomes so overwhelming that the city runs out of consecrated ground for burials. Here's where medieval record-keeping becomes both fascinating and frustrating for modern historians. Some chroniclers provide specific numbers, claiming that 800 people died daily in Paris at the plague's peak, while others resort to biblical language, describing the pestilence as worse than the plagues of Egypt. Historians still argue whether these numerical accounts represent accurate record-keeping or medieval writers' tendency toward dramatic exaggeration. The plague's journey through France reveals the interconnected nature of medieval European society. Monasteries, which serve as centers of learning, healthcare, and hospitality, become inadvertent distribution points for the disease. Pilgrims seeking spiritual comfort or medical treatment at religious sites carry the plague from community to community. The very institutions that provide stability and care in normal times become vectors for the pandemic's spread. You witnessed the plague's arrival in England through the port of Melcombe Regis, modern-day Weymouth, in June 1348. A ship from Gascony, carrying infected sailors, brings the disease across the English Channel. The English chronicler Henry Knighton describes the plague's landing with apocalyptic language, writing that the cruel death scattered its poisonous breath across the island. The English experience with the Black Death becomes particularly well documented because of the country's relatively advanced administrative systems. Manor rolls, court records, and ecclesiastical documents provide detailed evidence of the plague's impact on rural communities. You can trace the disease's progress village by village, watching as entire communities disappear from historical records. In the village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire, archaeological evidence reveals the complete abandonment of the settlement during the plague years. Houses are left with cooking pots still on hearths, tools abandoned in fields, and personal belongings scattered as if people simply vanished. This pattern repeats across England. Entire villages become ghost towns, their populations either dead or fled to seek survival elsewhere. The plague reaches London by September 1348, and the city becomes a laboratory for observing the disease's urban impact. London's narrow streets, crowded tenements, and poor sanitation create ideal conditions for plague transmission. A city's population, estimated at around 80,000 before the plague, may have dropped to as low as 35,000 by 1350. But here's a quirky detail that reveals medieval priorities. Even as London burns through its population, city authorities remain concerned about maintaining proper burial procedures. They establish new cemeteries outside the city walls and issue regulations about proper shrouding of corpses. The famous Charterhouse Monastery receives a massive donation specifically to create a plague cemetery which eventually holds thousands of bodies in carefully organized mass graves. The plague's impact on English agriculture creates a labor crisis that will reshape the country's social structure. With so many agricultural workers dead, surviving peasants find themselves in unprecedented demand. The traditional system of villenage, where peasants are bound to work their lord's land in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots, begins to break down when there simply aren't enough peasants to maintain it. You watch as surviving peasants begin to demand wages for their labor, something that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Some abandon their traditional holdings entirely, moving to areas where landlords offer better terms. This mobility of labor represents a fundamental shift in English society, laying the groundwork for the eventual end of serfdom. The English government's response to these labor shortages reveals the tension between economic necessity and social tradition. In 1349, King Edward III issues the Ordinance of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving between employers. The law proves largely unenforceable. You can't legislate away the basic economics of supply and demand, especially when the supply of labor has been cut in half. The plague's journey continues northward into Scotland, where it arrives in 1349. The Scots, who have been almost constantly at war with England, initially see the plague devastating their enemies as a sign of divine favor. Some Scottish chroniclers even refer to it as the foul death of the English. This optimism proves tragically misplaced when the disease crosses the border and begins killing. Scots with equal enthusiasm. Ireland experiences its own unique plague. Narrative. The disease arrives through trade connections with England and spreads rapidly through the Anglo-Norman settlements along the coast. However, the native Irish population in the interior initially suffers less severely, possibly due to their more dispersed settlement patterns and limited contact with urban centers. This differential impact creates lasting demographic and political consequences, strengthening Gaelic Irish culture relative to Anglo-Norman colonization. The plague's arrival in Wales coincides with ongoing political tensions between English rule and Welsh independence movements. Some Welsh chroniclers interpret the plague as divine judgment against English occupation, while others see it as punishment for the sins of all peoples. The disease doesn't discriminate based on political allegiance. It kills Welsh and English with equal efficiency. By 1349, the plague has crossed the English Channel in the opposite direction, reaching the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The region's dense network of trading cities and extensive commercial connections with England and France make it particularly vulnerable to rapid plague transmission. Cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp, which have grown wealthy from textile production and international trade, become plague hotspots. The Low Countries' experience with the Black Death reveals the plague's particular impact on urban artisan communities. The region's textile industry depends on skilled craftsmen, weavers, dyers, fullers, whose knowledge and experience take years to develop. When the plague kills large numbers of these skilled workers, entire industries face collapse. Some textile centers never fully recover their pre-plague production levels. You observe the plague's progression into the German states, where it encounters the complex political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike the more centralized kingdoms of France and England, Germany consists of hundreds of semi-independent territories, each with its own response to the crisis. Some cities close their gates to travelers, while others maintain open trade policies. This patchwork of responses creates a complex pattern of plague transmission across the region. The German experience with the Black Death becomes notorious for the persecution of Jewish communities. As the plague spreads and traditional explanations prove inadequate, many Christian communities turn to scapegoating. Jews are accused of poisoning wells, spreading disease through sorcery, or conspiring with demons to destroy Christian civilization. These accusations lead to horrific massacres in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death reveals the dangerous intersection of pandemic fear and existing social tensions. Jewish communities, already marginalized and subject to various restrictions, become convenient targets for populations seeking someone to blame for incomprehensible suffering. Pope Clement VI issues bulls condemning the persecution and pointing out that Jews are dying from the plague at the same rates as Christians. But his interventions have limited effect on local violence. Here's a detail that modern conspiracy theorists might find familiar. Some medieval communities become convinced that the plague is the result of deliberate poisoning rather than natural disease. Confessions are extracted under torture. Evidence is manufactured, and entire communities are destroyed based on fabricated plots. The parallels to modern pandemic conspiracy theories are both striking and disturbing. The plague's journey through Central Europe follows major river systems and trade routes. The Danube, Rhine, and Elbe rivers serve as highways for disease transmission, connecting infected cities to previously healthy communities upstream and downstream. You can trace the plague's progress by following these waterways, watching as it spreads from major commercial centers to smaller market towns and rural areas. Vienna, the Habsburg capital, experiences the plague in 1349 with particular severity. The city's position at the crossroads of European trade routes makes it a natural collection point for infected travelers from multiple directions. Contemporary accounts describe the city's streets filled with corpses and the complete breakdown of normal municipal services. The plague's impact on Vienna contributes to broader political instability within the Holy Roman Empire. The plague reaches Poland and Hungary by 1349 to 1350, though some regions of Eastern Europe experience lower mortality rates than Western European areas. Historians still debate the reasons for this differential impact. Some suggest that Eastern European populations had different genetic susceptibilities to plague. Others point to differences in settlement patterns, trade connections, or previous exposure to related diseases. Bohemia, under the rule of Charles IV, later Holy Roman Emperor, implements some of the most sophisticated anti-plague measures of the medieval period. The kingdom establishes quarantine procedures, regulates burial practices, and attempts to maintain trade while limiting disease transmission. These efforts may contribute to Bohemia's relatively lower plague mortality, though the disease still causes significant demographic and economic disruption. The plague's arrival in Scandinavia demonstrates the disease's ability to spread even to relatively isolated regions. Ships from infected German ports carry the plague to Denmark in 1349, and from there it spreads to Sweden and Norway. The harsh northern climate doesn't provide protection. The plague kills Scandinavians at rates comparable to the rest of Europe. Norway's experience with the Black Death proves particularly devastating because of the country's small population and limited agricultural resources. Some estimates suggest that Norway loses up to 60% of its population making it one of the hardest-hit regions in Europe. The demographic collapse contributes to Norway's eventual union with Denmark and Sweden, as the country lacks sufficient population to maintain independent political institutions. The plague reaches Iceland in 1402 to 1404, carried by ships from infected European ports. This delayed arrival more than 50 years after the plague's initial European outbreak demonstrates the disease's persistence and the interconnected nature of medieval trade networks. Iceland's isolation doesn't provide protection. It simply delays the inevitable. The Icelandic experience with the plague becomes particularly well documented because of the island's strong literary tradition. Icelandic sagas and chronicles provide detailed accounts of the plague's impact on this remote society. The disease kills an estimated 2/3 of Iceland's population, making it one of the most severely affected regions in the entire pandemic. By 1350, the plague has established itself across virtually all of Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. The speed of this continental conquest, accomplished in just 3 years, demonstrates both the interconnected nature of medieval European society and the plague's terrifying efficiency as a killer. The demographic impact of the Black Death's European phase cannot be overstated. Conservative estimates suggest that Europe loses 1/3 of its population, while some regions experience mortality rates approaching 90%. This represents the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded European history, comparable only to the population collapses experienced by Native American societies following European contact. But the plague's impact extends far beyond simple mortality statistics. You're witnessing the transformation of European civilization itself changes in labor relations, religious beliefs, artistic expression, and political structures that will shape the continent for centuries to come. The medieval world that existed before 1347 will never return. Something entirely new is being born from the ashes of the old order. The plague's European journey also reveals the limitations of medieval medical knowledge and public health measures. Despite centuries of medical scholarship building on Greek, Roman, and Islamic traditions, European physicians prove helpless against the pandemic. Their treatments, bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayer provide no protection against a disease they cannot understand or effectively combat. Yet within this medical failure, you can also see the seeds of future scientific progress. Some physicians begin to make accurate observations about the plague's contagious nature, even if they can't explain the mechanism of transmission. The pandemic's devastating impact will eventually motivate new approaches to medical research and public health that will benefit future generations. The Black Death's conquest of Europe represents just the beginning of its global impact. While the disease devastates European society, it simultaneously spreads eastward into Asia and southward into Africa, creating a truly worldwide pandemic that will reshape human civilization across multiple continents. But that's a story for our next section, where we'll follow the plague's journey beyond European borders into the broader medieval world. Asterisk. You're traveling along the ancient Silk Road in 1346, part of a merchant caravan carrying precious goods between the great cities of Central Asia and the Mediterranean world. The route you're following has connected east and west for over a millennium, facilitating not just trade, but the exchange of ideas, technologies, and unfortunately, diseases. What you don't realize is that you're witnessing the final golden age of this legendary trade network. The Black Death is about to transform it into a highway of devastation. The plague's journey eastward from its European epicenters follows these same trade routes in reverse, spreading back toward its likely origins in Central Asia and beyond. But the disease doesn't simply retrace its steps. It creates new patterns of transmission and devastation across the vast expanse of medieval Asia. You're about to witness how a pandemic that began in the steppes of Mongolia returns to reshape the very societies that may have given it birth. Your caravan stops in Samarkand, that jewel of Central Asian commerce, where merchants from China, India, Persia, and Europe gather to exchange goods and gossip. The city's bazaars normally buzz with activity as traders haggle over silk, spices, precious stones, and exotic manufactures. But something is wrong. Many stalls stand empty, and those merchants who remain speak in hushed tones about a terrible pestilence spreading along the trade routes. The plague's impact on Central Asian trading cities proves particularly devastating because these communities depend entirely on long-distance commerce for their prosperity. When trade networks collapse due to plague mortality, entire cities face economic ruin even before the disease arrives. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other Silk Road centers experience a double catastrophe: demographic collapse followed by economic devastation. Here's a fascinating detail that reveals the interconnected nature of medieval Eurasian trade: Chinese porcelain. Found in European archaeological sites from the 14th century shows a sharp decline in quality and quantity after 1350. This suggests that the plague's disruption of trade networks affected manufacturing and commerce across the entire breadth of Asia. From the Mediterranean to the Pacific Dot, you witness the plague's arrival in the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East, where it encounters sophisticated urban civilizations that have flourished for centuries. Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and other great Islamic cities become testing grounds for how advanced medieval societies cope with pandemic disease. The results are sobering. Even the most developed urban centers of the 14th century prove helpless against the Black Death's advance. Cairo, one of the largest cities in the world at this time, with a population exceeding 400,000, experiences catastrophic mortality. The Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, writing during the plague years, describes streets filled with corpses, mass, graves that can't be dug fast enough, and the complete breakdown of normal urban services. The city's famous Al-Azhar University, a center of Islamic learning for centuries, loses so many scholars that entire fields of knowledge nearly disappear. The plague's impact on Islamic civilization extends beyond simple mortality to affect religious and intellectual life. Many Islamic scholars interpret the pandemic through theological lenses, debating whether it represents divine punishment, a test of faith, or simply natural disaster. These discussions produce sophisticated theological and philosophical works that influence Islamic thought for centuries. But here's where Islamic responses to the plague differ significantly from Christian ones. Islamic law and tradition generally discourage the persecution of minority communities during crises. While European Jews face horrific massacres during the Black Death, Jewish and Christian communities in Islamic lands generally don't experience systematic persecution. This difference reflects broader distinctions between Islamic and Christian approaches to religious diversity and social crisis. The great physician and philosopher Ibn Khatima, working in Granada during the plague years, produces some of the most accurate medieval observations about disease transmission. He correctly identifies that the plague spreads through contact with infected individuals and contaminated objects. observations that won't be fully accepted in European medical circles for several more centuries. His work represents the high point of medieval Islamic medicine's response to pandemic disease. You follow the plague's path into the Ottoman Empire, which is just beginning its rise to become one of the world's great powers. The Ottomans' military expansion across Anatolia and into the Balkans creates perfect conditions for plague transmission armies on the move, displaced populations, disrupted agricultural systems, and the constant mixing of people from different regions. The Ottoman response to the plague reveals the pragmatic nature of this emerging empire. Unlike some medieval rulers who rely primarily on prayer and traditional remedies, Ottoman administrators implement practical measures: quarantine, procedures for ships, regulation of urban sanitation, and systematic efforts to maintain food supplies during plague outbreaks. These measures don't prevent the plague, but they do demonstrate the administrative sophistication that will help the Ottoman Empire survive and thrive. Despite demographic catastrophes, the plague's journey into Persia, modern-day Iran, encounters a civilization already weakened by political fragmentation and economic disruption. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol successor state that has ruled Persia since the 13th century, is collapsing due to internal conflicts and administrative failures. The Black Death arrives at precisely the moment when Persian society is least capable of mounting an effective response. You witness the plague's devastating impact on Persian cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz. These centers of Persian culture, famous for their poetry, art, and scholarship, experience mortality rates comparable to European cities. The Persian poet Hafez, writing during this period, captures the era's mood of despair and uncertainty in verses that speak of death stalking the streets and the futility of human ambition in the face of divine judgment. The plague spread through. Persia follows both overland trade routes and maritime connections through the Persian Gulf. Ships carrying infected passengers and cargo spread the disease to port cities, while merchant caravans carry it inland to major commercial centers. The result is a coordinated assault on Persian civilization from multiple directions, simultaneously. Here's a detail that historians still debate. Some Persian sources suggest that certain nomadic groups in remote mountain and desert regions experience lower plague mortality than urban populations. This pattern, if accurate, might reflect differences in settlement density, trade connections, or previous exposure to related diseases. However, the evidence is fragmentary, and historians still argue whether these accounts represent accurate observation or wishful thinking by chroniclers seeking to identify plague-resistant populations. The plague's arrival in the Indian subcontinent creates one of the pandemic's most complex and poorly documented chapters. India's vast size, diverse populations, and multiple political entities make it difficult to trace the disease's exact path and impact. What's clear is that the plague reaches India through both overland routes from Central Asia and maritime connections with the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. You observe the plague's impact on the Delhi Sultanate, the Islamic state that dominates northern India during the 14th century. The Sultanate's capital, Delhi, experiences severe plague mortality that contributes to broader political instability. The constant warfare between the Sultanate and various Hindu kingdoms creates ideal conditions for plague transmission armies. On the move, displaced populations, and disrupted agricultural systems. The plague's interaction with India's complex religious and social systems produces unique patterns of response and interpretation. Hindu communities often interpret the pandemic through concepts of karma and cosmic cycles, while Muslim populations apply Islamic theological frameworks. These different interpretative traditions sometimes lead to tensions, but they also create a rich dialogue about suffering, divine justice, and human responsibility during crisis. Indian medical traditions, building on centuries of Ayurvedic knowledge, produce their own responses to the plague. Indian physicians experiment with herbal remedies, dietary modifications, and lifestyle changes designed to restore bodily balance and resist disease. While these treatments prove no more effective than European or Islamic remedies, they represent sophisticated attempts to understand and combat pandemic disease within established medical frameworks. The plague's impact on Indian Ocean trade. Networks creates ripple effects across the entire region. Indian merchants, who have long served as intermediaries between East Asian and Middle Eastern markets, find their commercial networks disrupted by plague mortality and economic collapse. Some traditional trading relationships that have existed for centuries never recover from the pandemic's impact. You follow the plague's path into Southeast Asia, where it encounters societies that have developed sophisticated maritime trading. Networks connecting the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, the Majapahit Empire in Java, the Sukhothai Kingdom in Thailand, and other Southeast Asian states experience plague outbreaks that arrive via infected ships from India and China. The plague's impact on Southeast Asian societies remains one of the least documented aspects of the global pandemic, partly because many of these societies rely on oral rather than written historical traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests significant demographic disruption in some areas, but the exact timing and extent of plague mortality remain unclear. What's fascinating about Southeast Asia's plague experience is how it intersects with the region's religious and cultural diversity. Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, and indigenous religious traditions all offer different frameworks for understanding and responding to pandemic disease. This diversity creates a complex mosaic of plague responses that varies significantly from community to community. The plague reaches China through multiple pathways: overland routes from Central Asia, maritime connections with Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean, and internal transmission networks within the Chinese Empire itself. China's experience with the Black Death proves particularly significant because the country may have been the plague's original source, making this a homecoming of sorts for the deadly bacterium. You witnessed the plague's impact on Yuan dynasty. China, where Mongol rulers have governed Chinese populations for nearly a century. The dynasty is already facing rebellions, economic difficulties, and administrative challenges when the plague arrives to compound these problems. The demographic and economic disruption caused by the Black Death contributes to the Yuan dynasties. Eventual collapse and replacement by the Ming dynasty in 1368. Chinese medical traditions, with their emphasis on balance, harmony, and preventive care, produce sophisticated responses to the plague. Chinese physicians experiment with acupuncture, herbal medicines, and dietary therapies designed to strengthen the body's resistance to disease. Some Chinese medical texts from this period provide remarkably accurate descriptions of plague symptoms and transmission patterns. The plague's impact on Chinese agriculture proves particularly devastating because the country's large population depends on intensive farming of relatively small plots of land. When plague mortality reduces the agricultural workforce, food production collapses in many regions. This agricultural crisis compounds the plague's direct mortality, creating famines that kill additional millions of people. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Chinese administrative sophistication. Some Chinese sources provide specific numerical accounts of plague mortality that are far more detailed than most European records. These accounts suggest the Chinese bureaucratic traditions of record keeping continued to function even during the pandemic's worst phases, providing modern historians with valuable data about the plague's demographic impact. The plague's arrival in Japan occurs later than in most other Asian regions, possibly due to the country's island geography and relatively limited trade connections with the mainland. When the plague does reach Japan, probably in the late 14th or early 15th century, it encounters a society that has developed unique approaches to disease prevention and treatment. Based on Buddhist and Shinto traditions, Japanese responses to the plague blend practical public health measures with religious and spiritual practices. Buddhist monasteries serve as centers for caring for plague victims, while Shinto purification rituals are adapted to address pandemic disease. The result is a distinctively Japanese approach to plague management that differs significantly from responses in other Asian societies. The plague's global journey reveals the truly interconnected nature of 14th century world systems. A disease that probably originated in the steppes of Central Asia spreads along trade networks to affect societies from England to Japan, from Scandinavia to Southeast Asia. This represents humanity's first truly global pandemic, demonstrating both the benefits and dangers of increasing international connectivity. But the plague's Asian journey also reveals significant variations in how different societies experience and respond to pandemic disease. While the basic biological reality of Yersinia pestis remains constant, its social, economic, and cultural impacts vary dramatically depending on local conditions, traditions, and circumstances. You're witnessing not just a medical catastrophe, but a fundamental transformation of Asian civilizations. The plague's demographic impact reshapes labor markets, political structures, and social relationships across the continent. Trade networks that have connected Asian societies for centuries are disrupted or destroyed. Political entities that have dominated regions for generations collapse or undergo radical transformation. The plague's impact on Asian religious and intellectual traditions proves equally profound. Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, and Confucian scholars all grapple with questions about suffering, divine justice, and human responsibility in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. These intellectual responses to the plague influence Asian religious and philosophical thought for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's Asian journey demonstrates the limitations of even the most sophisticated pre-modern societies when confronted with pandemic disease. Whether we're talking about the advanced urban civilizations of the Islamic world, the bureaucratic sophistication of Chinese administration, or the commercial networks of Indian Ocean traders, none prove capable of preventing or effectively treating the Black Death. Yet, within this story of devastation and failure, you can also see evidence of human resilience and adaptation. Societies that survive the plague often emerge with new institutions, practices, and knowledge that better prepare them for future challenges. The pandemic becomes a catalyst for innovation and change, even as it destroys much of the existing order. The plague's journey across Asia also reveals the complex relationship between disease and historical change. The Black Death doesn't simply kill people and then disappear. It fundamentally alters the trajectory of Asian civilizations, contributing to the fall of some empires, the rise of others, and the transformation of social, economic, and political structures across the continent. As we follow the plague's path across Asia, we're witnessing the end of one historical era and the beginning of another. The medieval world system that has connected Asian societies for centuries is being transformed by pandemic disease into something entirely new. The full implications of these changes won't become clear for generations, but you're watching the birth of the early modern world from the ashes of medieval civilization. The plague's Asian journey also demonstrates the global nature of human vulnerability to infectious disease. Despite the vast distances, cultural differences, and political boundaries that separate Asian societies, they all prove equally susceptible to the same bacterial pathogen. This shared vulnerability creates a common human experience that transcends the usual divisions of geography, culture, and politics. Asterisk, you're standing in the bustling port of Alexandria in 1347, watching ships arrive from plague-ravaged European and Asian ports. This ancient city, founded by Alexander the Great and once home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, serves as a crucial link between Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade networks. What you're witnessing is the moment when the Black Death makes its grand entrance into Africa, beginning a continental journey that will reshape African civilizations, just as dramatically as it has transformed Europe and Asia. The plague's arrival in Egypt occurs through multiple pathways simultaneously. Infected ships from Genoa, Constantinople, and other Mediterranean ports bring the disease to Alexandria and other coastal cities. Meanwhile, overland trade routes from Syria and Palestine carry infected merchants and pilgrims into the Nile Delta. The result is a coordinated assault on Egyptian civilization from both sea and land. Cairo, the largest city in Africa and one of the world's great urban centers, becomes ground zero for the plague's African campaign. With a population exceeding 400,000 people, Cairo offers the perfect environment for rapid disease transmission, dense urban neighborhoods, bustling markets, and constant movement of people from across the known world. The city's role as a center of Islamic learning and pilgrimage makes it a natural collection point for infected travelers. You witness the plague's devastating impact on Cairo's famous Al-Azhar University, founded in 970 CE as one of the world's first universities. This center of Islamic scholarship, which has attracted students and teachers from across the Muslim world for centuries, loses so many faculty and students that entire academic disciplines nearly disappear. The university's vast library, containing irreplaceable manuscripts on medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and theology, becomes a tomb as scholars die faster than their knowledge can be transmitted to successors. The Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, writing during the plague years, provides some of our most detailed contemporary accounts of the pandemic's impact on African society. He describes Cairo's streets filled with corpses, mass graves that can't be dug fast enough, and the complete breakdown of normal urban services. His chronicles paint a picture of civilization itself collapsing under the weight of incomprehensible mortality. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's impact on Islamic religious practices. Cairo's numerous mosques, which normally serve as centers of community life, become overwhelmed with funeral services. The traditional Islamic requirement for prompt burial becomes impossible to fulfill when hundreds of people die daily. Religious authorities are forced to modify burial practices, allowing mass graves and simplified funeral rites that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The plague's economic impact on Egypt proves particularly severe because the country serves as a crucial link in international trade networks. Egyptian merchants have grown wealthy by facilitating commerce between Europe, Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. When plague mortality disrupts these trade relationships, Egypt's economy collapses even in regions that don't experience severe disease. Outbreaks. You observe the plague's impact on Egypt's agricultural system, which depends on the annual Nile flood and intensive cultivation of the river valley. When plague mortality reduces the agricultural workforce, food production collapses in many regions. This agricultural crisis compounds the plague's direct mortality, creating famines that kill additional thousands of people. The land of the pharaohs, which has fed civilizations for millennia, struggles to feed its own reduced population. The plague spread southward along the Nile River, following trade routes that connect Egypt with Nubia and the kingdoms of the Hia. Upper Nile. These societies, which have maintained complex relationships with Egypt for centuries, experience their own plague outbreaks as infected merchants and travelers carry the disease upstream. The result is a cascade of demographic and political disruption that affects the entire Nile River system. Nubia, the ancient kingdom that once rivaled Egypt for control of the Nile Valley, experiences severe plague mortality that contributes to its final decline as an independent power. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Nubian cities are abandoned during the 14th century, possibly due to plague-related demographic collapse. The kingdom that once produced the Black Pharaohs, who ruled Egypt itself, becomes a shadow of its former glory. The plague's journey into sub-Saharan Africa follows both Nile River routes and trans-Saharan trade networks that connect North Africa with the great kingdoms of the Western Sudan. These trade routes, which have carried gold, salt, slaves, and exotic goods for centuries, now serve as highways for disease transmission. You're witnessing the moment when the Black Death penetrates the Sahara Desert to reach the heart of medieval African civilization. The Great Mali Empire, which dominates West Africa during the 14th century, encounters the plague through its extensive trade connections with North Africa. Malian merchants, who have grown wealthy by controlling gold mines and salt deposits, maintain regular contact with Egyptian and Maghrebi traders. These commercial relationships, which have brought prosperity to Mali for generations, now carry deadly cargo southward across the desert. You witness the plague's impact on Timbuktu, that legendary center of learning and commerce on the southern edge of the Sahara. This city, which serves as a crucial link between North and West Africa, experiences plague outbreaks that devastate its population of scholars, merchants, and craftsmen. The famous Sankar University, which rivals Cairo's Al-Azhar as a center of Islamic learning, loses many of its most distinguished faculty and students. The plague's arrival in West Africa creates unique challenges because many societies in this region practice traditional religions alongside or instead of Islam. These communities must interpret pandemic disease through indigenous religious frameworks that may not include concepts of divine punishment or cosmic judgment common in Christian and Islamic responses to the plague. The result is a diverse array of spiritual and practical responses to the pandemic. Here's a fascinating detail about African responses to the plague. Some West African societies have long-standing traditions of quarantine and disease management. developed through experience with other epidemic diseases. These practices, which may include isolating infected individuals, restricting travel during outbreaks, and using herbal medicines to treat symptoms, represent sophisticated indigenous approaches to public health that parallel measures being implemented in Europe and Asia. That the plague's impact on trans-Saharan trade networks creates lasting changes in African economic and political systems. Trade routes that have connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world for centuries are disrupted by plague mortality and economic collapse. Some traditional trading relationships never recover, forcing African societies to develop new commercial networks and economic strategies. You observe the plague's effects on the great Zimbabwe civilization in southeastern Africa, though the evidence for plague impact in this region remains controversial among historians. Some archaeological evidence suggests demographic disruption during the 14th century, but it's unclear whether this results from plague, climate change, political instability, or other factors. The debate reveals how much we still don't know about the Black Death's global impact. The plague's journey along the East African coast follows maritime trade networks that connect the Swahili city-states with the Indian Ocean world. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Mogadishu, which have grown wealthy through trade with India, Persia, and China, experience plague outbreaks carried by infected ships from across the Indian Ocean. These coastal societies, which represent some of Africa's most cosmopolitan and commercially sophisticated communities, prove as vulnerable to the plague as their counterparts in Europe and Asia. The Swahili response to the plague blends Islamic religious traditions with indigenous African practices, creating unique approaches to pandemic management. Swahili scholars write treatises on plague prevention and treatment that combine Islamic medical knowledge with local herbal remedies and spiritual practices. These texts represent fascinating examples of cultural synthesis in the face of global crisis. The plague's impact on African slavery systems creates complex and often contradictory effects. In some regions, high plague mortality increases the value of surviving slaves, making slave raiding more profitable for societies that engage in this practice. In other areas, demographic collapse reduces both the supply of potential slaves and the demand for slave labor, disrupting established patterns of human trafficking. Here's a detail that reveals the interconnected nature of medieval African societies. Chinese porcelain and Indian textiles found in 14th century African archaeological sites show changes in quantity and distribution, patterns that may reflect plague-related disruptions in international trade networks. These material culture changes suggest that the Black Death's impact on Africa extends far beyond direct mortality to affect the continent's connections with the broader world. The plague's African journey also reveals the limitations of our historical sources for understanding pandemic impact in non-literate societies. While we have detailed chronicles from Egypt and other Islamic regions, much of sub-Saharan Africa relies on oral historical traditions that may not preserve specific information about 14th century plague outbreaks. This documentary gap makes it difficult to assess the full extent of the plague's African impact. Archaeological evidence provides some clues about plague-related demographic changes in Africa, but interpreting this evidence requires careful analysis. Abandoned settlements, changes in burial practices, and shifts in material culture patterns may all reflect plague impact, but they could also result from climate change, political upheaval, or economic transformation. Historians continue to debate how to read these archaeological signatures. The plague's interaction with Africa's diverse disease environments creates unique patterns of transmission and mortality. African populations have evolved resistance to various tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever, but they may lack immunity to plague and other diseases common in temperate regions. This differential disease susceptibility creates complex patterns of vulnerability that vary significantly across the continent. You witness the plague's impact on African religious and intellectual traditions, which must grapple with questions about suffering, divine justice, and human responsibility in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. Islamic scholars in cities like Cairo, Fez, and Timbuktu produce sophisticated theological responses to the pandemic, while traditional African religions develop their own interpretative frameworks for understanding mass mortality. The plagues. African journey demonstrates the truly global nature of 14th century disease transmission. A bacterium that probably originated in Central Asia spreads along trade networks to affect African societies from the Mediterranean coast to the Indian Ocean, from the Sahara Desert to the tropical forests of the Congo Basin. This represents an unprecedented example of biological globalization in the pre-modern world. But the plague's impact on Africa also reveals the resilience and adaptability of African societies in the face of demographic catastrophe. Communities that survive the plague often develop new institutions, practices, and knowledge that better prepare them for future challenges. The pandemic becomes a catalyst for innovation and change, even as it destroys much of the existing order. Plague's African experience also highlights the complex relationship between disease and historical development. The Black Death doesn't simply kill people and disappear. It fundamentally alters the trajectory of African civilizations, contributing to the decline of some kingdoms, the rise of others, and the transformation of social, economic, and political structures across the continent. As you follow the plague's path across Africa, you're witnessing the end of one historical era and the beginning of another. The medieval African world system, with its complex networks of trade, scholarship, and cultural exchange, is being transformed by pandemic disease into something entirely new. The full implications of these changes won't become clear for generations. But you're watching the birth of early modern Africa from the ashes of medieval civilization. The plague's African journey also reveals the fundamental interconnectedness of human societies in the 14th century. Despite the vast distances and cultural differences that separate African communities from their counterparts in Europe and Asia, they all prove equally vulnerable to the same bacterial pathogen. This shared vulnerability creates a common human experience that transcends the usual divisions of geography, culture, and politics. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's impact on Africa demonstrates that the Black Death truly represents humanity's first global pandemic. No continent remains untouched, no civilization proves immune, and no society escapes the fundamental transformations that follow in the plague's wake. You're witnessing a biological event that reshapes the entire human world, creating the demographic and social conditions that will define the early modern period across all continents. You're sitting in a medieval physician study in Paris in 1348, surrounded by ancient medical texts, astrological charts, and jars filled with mysterious remedies. The learned doctor, trained at the prestigious University of Paris Medical School, confidently explains that the plague results from a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn that occurred in 1345, creating a corruption of the air that spreads poisonous vapors across the earth. His certainty would be comforting if it weren't so completely wrong. Medieval medicine in the 14th century represents a fascinating blend of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, Islamic scholarship, Christian theology, and folk traditions. Physicians have access to translations of Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and other medical authorities, creating a sophisticated theoretical framework for understanding health and disease. Unfortunately, this framework proves utterly inadequate when confronted with the Black Death. The dominant medical theory of the time, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, holds that health depends on maintaining proper balance among the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease occurs when these humors become imbalanced, usually due to environmental factors, dietary choices, or moral failings. This humoral theory provides a comprehensive explanation for most medical conditions except for a bacterial infection that medieval physicians cannot even imagine. You watch as physicians attempt to apply humoral theory to plague treatment. Since the plague produces fever, sweating, and other hot symptoms, doctors conclude that patients suffer from an excess of hot, moist humors. The logical treatment involves cooling and drying the body through bloodletting, purging, and dietary restrictions. These interventions not only fail to help plague victims, but often weaken them further, making death more likely. Here's a detail that reveals medieval medicine's sophisticated theoretical structure. Physicians can explain virtually any symptom within the humoral framework. Buboes result from corrupted blood seeking exit from the body. Fever indicates excessive heat that must be cooled. Delirium shows that poisonous vapors have reached the brain. The theory is internally consistent and intellectually satisfying. It's just based on completely incorrect assumptions about how disease actually works. The most prestigious medical schools of Europe, Paris, Bologna, Montpellier, Oxford produce learned physicians who can quote ancient authorities, cast astrological charts, and diagnose humoral imbalances with impressive precision. But when the plague arrives, these scholarly doctors prove no more effective than village-wise women or traveling charlatans. Their expensive education becomes worthless when confronted with a disease that doesn't follow classical medical rules. You observe the desperate search for effective plague treatments as physicians experiment with increasingly bizarre remedies. Some recommend drinking ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, mixed with wine. Others prescribe theriac, a legendary cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, and various exotic spices. The wealthy pay enormous sums for these supposed remedies, which provide no protection against bacterial infection. The plague's resistance to traditional treatments creates a crisis of medical authority that reverberates throughout European society. If learned physicians trained in ancient wisdom cannot cure the pestilence, what value does their knowledge possess? Some communities begin to trust folk healers, religious mystics, or anyone claiming special knowledge about plague prevention. The medical profession's prestige suffers damage that takes centuries to repair. But within this medical failure, you can also observe the beginnings of more scientific approaches to disease. Some physicians begin to make careful observations about plague transmission, noting that the disease spreads through contact with infected individuals rather than through corrupted air alone. These empirical observations, while still embedded in incorrect theoretical frameworks, represent early steps toward more accurate understanding of infectious disease. the Islamic world's medical response to the plague, demonstrates both the sophistication and limitations of medieval Islamic medicine. Islamic physicians have access to a broader range of medical texts than their European counterparts, including works by al-Razi ibn Sina, Avicenna, and other great Islamic medical scholars. They also benefit from more extensive practical experience. With epidemic diseases through their connections with trade networks spanning from Spain to Central Asia. Ibn Khatima, working in Granada during the plague years, produces remarkably accurate observations about disease transmission. He correctly identifies that plague spreads through contact with infected individuals and contaminated objects, observations that won't be fully accepted in European medical circles for several more centuries. His work represents the high point of medieval medical thinking about infectious disease, even though he lacks the theoretical framework to explain why his observations are correct. You witness the development of quarantine practices, which represent one of the few effective public health measures available to medieval societies. The Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, implement systematic quarantine procedures for ships arriving from infected ports. These measures, based on empirical observation rather than medical theory, prove partially effective in slowing plague transmission. The concept of quarantine itself reveals medieval societies' growing understanding that plague spreads through human contact rather than corrupted air alone. If the disease truly resulted from atmospheric corruption, isolating infected individuals would be pointless. The fact that quarantine sometimes works suggests that medieval people are beginning to grasp the contagious nature of plague, even if they can't explain the mechanism. Here's a quirky detail about medieval plague prevention. Some physicians recommend surrounding yourself with pleasant smells to counteract the corrupted air that supposedly causes disease. Wealthy individuals carry pomanders, decorative containers filled with aromatic spices, believing that pleasant odors provide protection against plague. This practice leads to a booming trade in exotic spices and perfumes, even as people continue dying at unprecedented rates. The plague's impact on medieval surgery and anatomy creates unexpected opportunities for medical advancement. With so many corpses available and traditional medical authorities discredited, some physicians begin performing autopsies to understand plague pathology. These dissections, while still interpreted through humoral theory, provide new anatomical knowledge that advances medical understanding. You observe the emergence of plague doctors, those iconic figures in their distinctive beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs. These physicians, often hired by city governments to treat plague victims, develop specialized protective equipment based on contemporary theories about disease transmission. While their treatments remain ineffective, their protective gear demonstrates medieval society's growing awareness that plague spreads through close contact with infected individuals. The plague doctor's costume-long leather coat, wide-brimmed hat, and that distinctive beaked mask becomes one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval medicine. The beak contains aromatic substances designed to purify corrupted air before it reaches the physician's lungs. While this protection proves ineffective against bacterial infection, it does create psychological distance between doctor and patient that may reduce transmission risk. Medieval hospitals, primarily run by religious orders, face overwhelming challenges during plague outbreaks. These institutions, designed to provide spiritual comfort and basic care for the poor, suddenly find themselves dealing with hundreds of dying patients. Most hospitals lack the resources, knowledge, or facilities to provide effective plague treatment, becoming instead places where people go to die with dignity. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, one of Europe's oldest and largest hospitals, experiences catastrophic mortality among both patients and staff during the plague years. Contemporary accounts describe hallways filled with corpses, overwhelmed burial facilities, and the complete breakdown of normal hospital procedures. The institution that has served Paris for centuries nearly collapses under the weight of pandemic. Disease.U witnessed the development of new medical texts specifically addressing plague treatment and prevention. These works, written by physicians who have direct experience with the disease, represent attempts to update classical medical knowledge based on contemporary observations. While still embedded in humoral theory, these texts contain valuable empirical observations about plague symptoms, transmission, and mortality patterns. The famous Tractatus de Epidemia, Treatise on Epidemic, by various authors, provides detailed descriptions of plague symptoms and recommended treatments. These texts circulate widely among educated physicians, creating a shared body of plague-related medical knowledge. Unfortunately, the treatments described, bloodletting, purging, herbal remedies, prove largely ineffective against bacterial infection. The plague's interaction with medieval pharmaceutical knowledge creates a boom in herbal medicine and exotic remedies. Physicians experiment with hundreds of different plant-based treatments, seeking the magical cure that will stop the pestilence. While most of these remedies prove useless, some may have provided limited symptomatic relief or psychological comfort to desperate patients. Medieval pharmacies, run by apothecaries who specialize in preparing and selling medicines, experience unprecedented demand during plague outbreaks. These shops, filled with jars of mysterious powders, exotic herbs, and precious stones believed to have medicinal properties, become centers of hope for communities seeking protection against the plague. The fact that their remedies don't work doesn't diminish the desperate demand for anything that might provide salvation. Here's a detail that reveals medieval medicine's sophisticated commercial aspects. The plague creates enormous profits for some medical practitioners, even as it destroys entire communities. Physicians who claim special knowledge about plague treatment charge enormous fees for their services. Apothecaries sell exotic remedies at inflated prices. The desperation created by pandemic disease generates significant wealth for those willing to exploit it. The plague's impact on medical education forces universities to reconsider their curricula and teaching methods. Traditional medical education, based primarily on reading ancient texts and engaging in theoretical debates, proves inadequate when confronted with unprecedented disease. Some medical schools begin emphasizing practical experience and empirical observation, laying groundwork for more scientific approaches to medicine. You observe the emergence of new medical specializations focused specifically on plague treatment and prevention. These plague doctors develop expertise in recognizing plague symptoms, implementing quarantine procedures, and managing large-scale mortality. While their treatments remain ineffective, their organizational skills prove valuable for maintaining some semblance of medical care during pandemic conditions. The plague's resistance to traditional treatments also encourages experimentation with alternative medical approaches. Some physicians turn to astrological medicine, seeking to time treatments according to planetary influences. Others experiment with alchemical remedies, believing that the philosopher's stone or other magical substances might cure the pestilence. These approaches, while scientifically worthless, demonstrate medieval medicine's willingness to explore new possibilities when traditional methods fail. The psychological impact of medical failure during the plague creates lasting changes in how medieval people view physicians and medical authority. The learned doctors who charge enormous fees for ineffective treatments lose credibility with communities that watch their neighbors die despite expensive medical care. This crisis of confidence contributes to the rise of alternative healers, religious mystics, and folk medicine practitioners. But perhaps most significantly, the plague's challenge to medieval medicine creates intellectual conditions that will eventually lead to more scientific approaches to disease. The failure of humoral theory when confronted with bacterial infection forces some physicians to question fundamental assumptions about health and disease. These doubts, while not immediately productive, plant seeds for future medical revolutions. You're witnessing not just medical failure, but the birth of medical skepticism, the recognition that traditional authorities might be wrong and that empirical observation might provide better guidance than ancient texts. This intellectual shift, triggered by the plague's resistance to classical treatments, represents a crucial step toward the scientific revolution that will transform medicine in later centuries. The Black Death's impact on medieval medicine demonstrates both the limitations of pre-scientific medical knowledge and the resilience of human efforts to understand and combat disease. While medieval physicians failed to cure the plague, their attempts to grapple with unprecedented mortality create new knowledge, new institutions, and new approaches that benefit future generations. Asterisk, you're standing in the cemetery of Holy Trinity Church in London in 1349, watching gravediggers work frantically to keep pace with the endless stream of corpses. The small parish graveyard, which normally receives perhaps a dozen burials per year, now accommodates that many bodies daily. The carefully maintained rows of individual graves have given way to massive trenches where bodies are stacked like cordwood, separated only by thin layers of earth, and QUICKLIME. The sheer logistics of disposing of plague dead creates unprecedented challenges for medieval communities. Traditional burial practices, which emphasize individual graves, proper shrouding, and religious ceremonies, become impossible when hundreds of people die daily in a single city. You're witnessing the complete breakdown of death rituals that have provided comfort and meaning to human societies for millennia. The Church of England, like religious institutions across Europe, struggles to maintain proper burial procedures during the plague's peak mortality. Canon law requires that bodies be buried in consecrated ground with appropriate religious ceremonies. But these requirements become impossible to fulfill when priests die as quickly as their parishioners. Some communities are forced to bury plague victims in unconsecrated ground or even in mass graves outside city walls. You observe the emergence of new burial practices specifically designed to cope with plague mortality. The famous East Smithfield Cemetery in London, established specifically for plague victims, eventually holds over 2,400 bodies in carefully organized mass graves. Archaeological excavations of this site reveal that even during the crisis, burial crews attempted to maintain some dignity for the dead, arranging bodies in orderly rows and avoiding the chaotic dumping that characterizes some plague cemeteries. Here's a detail that reveals medieval priorities even during catastrophe. Wealthy plague victims often receive individual burial in expensive coffins, while the poor are buried in mass graves with minimal ceremony. Social class distinctions persist even in death, creating a hierarchy of burial practices that reflects broader inequalities in medieval society. The plague may be a great equalizer in terms of mortality, but it doesn't eliminate social distinctions in how the dead are treated. The psychological impact of mass burial practices creates lasting trauma for plague survivors. Medieval people, accustomed to elaborate funeral rituals that provide closure and spiritual comfort, find themselves unable to properly mourn their dead. Families watch loved ones disappear into anonymous mass graves, denied the individual recognition, and religious ceremonies that traditionally ease the transition from life to death. You witness the emergence of professional body collectors, grim figures who roam city streets gathering corpses for mass burial. These men, often criminals or social outcasts who volunteer for dangerous work in exchange for payment or pardons, become essential to maintaining basic sanitation during plague outbreaks. Their work, while necessary, carries enormous social, stigma, and psychological burden. The famous "Bring Out Your Dead" cry, immortalized in later literature and film, reflects the reality of plague-era body collection. These collectors, working with handcarts or simple wagons, make regular rounds through infected neighborhoods, gathering corpses that families leave outside their homes. The sight and sound of these death wagons becomes one of the most traumatic aspects of plague experience for survivors. The plague's impact on funeral industries creates both opportunities and challenges for medieval craftsmen. Coffin makers, grave diggers, and other death-related professions experience unprecedented demand for their services. However, many of these workers also die from plague exposure, creating labor shortages even as demand skyrockets. Some communities offer premium wages and special protections to encourage people to work in death-related occupations. You observe the development of new technologies and techniques for managing mass mortality. Some cities experiment with lime kilns for rapid body disposal, while others develop more efficient digging techniques for mass graves. These innovations, born from desperate necessity, represent medieval society's attempts to maintain basic sanitation and human dignity in the face of unprecedented death rates. The plague's challenge to traditional burial practices also affects religious beliefs about death and afterlife. Medieval Christianity emphasizes the importance of proper burial for ensuring salvation and resurrection. But the plague makes such burials impossible for many victims. This creates theological crises as survivors worry about the spiritual fate of loved ones who receive improper burial or no burial at all. Religious authorities attempt to address these concerns by issuing special dispensations for plague-era burial practices. Pope Clement VI declares that plague victims who die without receiving last rites can still achieve salvation, and that mass burial doesn't prevent resurrection. These papal pronouncements provide some comfort to grieving communities, but they also represent significant departures from traditional Catholic teaching about death and burial. The plague's impact on cemetery space creates urban planning challenges that persist for centuries. Medieval cities, designed for much smaller populations and lower mortality rates, simply lack sufficient burial space for plague victims. New cemeteries must be established outside city walls, often on land previously used for agriculture or other purposes. These emergency burial grounds sometimes become permanent features of urban landscapes. You witness the transformation of religious spaces as churches and monasteries become overwhelmed with funeral services. Some churches hold continuous funeral masses, with new corpses arriving before previous services conclude. The normal rhythm of religious life, daily prayers, seasonal celebrations, community gatherings gives way to an endless cycle of death and mourning. The plague's impact on mourning practices reveals deep cultural tensions between individual grief and community. Survival. Traditional mourning periods, which might last weeks or months, become impossible when families lose multiple members and communities face ongoing mortality. Survivors must balance personal grief with practical necessities of maintaining basic social functions. Here's a fascinating detail about plague-era mourning. Some communities develop abbreviated mourning rituals specifically designed for pandemic conditions. These compressed ceremonies attempt to provide spiritual comfort and social recognition for the dead, while acknowledging the practical impossibility of traditional extended mourning. The result is a new form of collective grieving that emphasizes community survival over individual loss. The plague's psychological impact on survivors creates what modern psychologists would recognize as mass trauma. People who witness unprecedented mortality, lose multiple family members, and face constant threat of death develop symptoms that we now associate with post-traumatic stress disorder. Medieval society lacks frameworks for understanding or treating such psychological damage, leaving survivors to cope with trauma through religious faith, alcohol, or simple denial. You observe the emergence of new forms of religious expression, specifically related to plague trauma. The memento mori tradition, artistic and literary reminders of death's inevitability, becomes increasingly popular in post-plague Europe. Churches commission paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that emphasize human mortality and the need for spiritual preparation. These works serve both as artistic expression and psychological coping mechanisms for traumatized communities. The famous Dance of Death motif, which appears in churches and manuscripts across Europe, represents one of the most sophisticated artistic responses to plague trauma. These depictions show death as a skeleton, leading people from all social classes in a macabre dance toward the grave. The imagery serves as both warning and comfort, warning the living to prepare for death, while providing comfort through the recognition that death comes to everyone regardless of social status. The plague's impact on family structures creates new forms of kinship and social organization. With so many traditional family units destroyed by mortality, survivors often form new household arrangements based on practical necessity rather than blood relationships. Orphan children are absorbed into surviving families. Widows and widowers remarry quickly, and extended family networks become crucial for survival. You witness the emergence of new inheritance practices designed to cope with rapid population turnover. Traditional inheritance laws, which assume that property passes from parents to children over normal lifespans, prove inadequate when entire families die within weeks. Some communities develop simplified inheritance procedures that allow rapid transfer of property to surviving relatives or community members. The plague's impact on childhood and adolescence creates a generation of survivors who have experienced trauma and loss on unprecedented scales. Children who survive the plague often become adults earlier than normal, taking on responsibilities and making decisions that would typically be reserved for older individuals. This accelerated maturation has lasting effects on post-plague societies, age structures, and social relationships. The plague's effect on marriage and reproduction patterns reflects both practical necessity and psychological trauma. Some survivors marry quickly to form new household units and replace lost family members. Others avoid marriage entirely, either due to psychological trauma or practical concerns about bringing children into a world where death seems omnipresent. These varying responses create complex demographic patterns that affect post-plague population recovery. You observe the development of new forms of community organization designed to provide support for plague survivors. Mutual aid societies, religious confraternities, and neighborhood associations emerged to provide practical assistance and emotional support for people who have lost traditional family networks. These organizations represent medieval society's attempts to rebuild social bonds in the aftermath of demographic catastrophe. The plague's impact on women's roles and status creates both opportunities and challenges. With so many men dead, women often inherit property, assume business responsibilities, and take on social roles that would normally be reserved for males. However, this increased responsibility comes at the cost of enormous personal loss and social disruption. Women become crucial to community survival, while simultaneously bearing the emotional burden of caring for plague survivors. The plague's effect on religious vocations reveals the complex relationship between crisis and faith. Some survivors interpret their survival as divine calling and enter religious life, swelling the ranks of monasteries and convents. Others lose faith entirely, abandoning religious practice in favor of secular pursuits. These divergent responses create lasting tensions within post-plague religious communities. You witness the emergence of new forms of charitable organization, specifically designed to address plague-related social problems. Hospitals for plague orphans, almshouses for destitute survivors, and burial societies for proper disposal of the dead represent medieval society's attempts to address the social consequences of demographic catastrophe. These institutions often outlast the plague itself, becoming permanent features of European social welfare systems. The plague's impact on education and knowledge transmission creates both losses and opportunities. Many schools and universities closed temporarily due to mortality among teachers and students. However, the social disruption also creates demand for new forms of education designed to train people for roles previously filled by plague victims. Some educational institutions emerge from the plague stronger and more innovative than before. The plague's effect on legal systems reflects the challenge of maintaining social order during demographic catastrophe. Traditional legal procedures, which assume stable populations and established social relationships, prove inadequate when communities lose large portions of their population. Some legal systems develop simplified procedures for property transfer, inheritance disputes, and criminal justice that reflect the realities of post-plague society. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's long-term social impact. Many European communities develop annual commemorations of plague outbreaks, creating collective memory practices that help survivors process trauma and maintain community identity. These observances, which might include special religious services, charitable activities, or community gatherings, serve both as memorial practices and social bonding mechanisms for traumatized populations. The plague's psychological legacy extends far beyond the immediate crisis, creating cultural attitudes about death, disease, and social vulnerability that persist for generations. Post-plague European culture becomes more concerned with mortality, more skeptical of traditional authorities, and more focused on individual survival and advancement. These cultural shifts contribute to broader changes that will eventually produce a Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world. You're witnessing not just demographic catastrophe, but the birth of new forms of human community forged in the crucible of unprecedented mortality. The social bonds, institutions, and cultural practices that emerge from plague trauma represent humanity's remarkable capacity to rebuild civilization, even after its foundations have been shattered. The communities that survive the Black Death often emerge stronger, more resilient, and better adapted to future challenges than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague's impact on social psychology also reveals the fundamental human need for meaning and community in the face of incomprehensible loss. Even during the worst phases of the pandemic, survivors continue to seek ways to honor their dead, support their living, and maintain hope for the future. These efforts, while sometimes inadequate to address the scale of trauma, demonstrate the resilience of human social bonds even under extreme stress. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's social and psychological impact creates the conditions for fundamental changes in European civilization. The breakdown of traditional social structures, the crisis of religious and political authority, and the trauma of unprecedented mortality all contribute to cultural and intellectual developments that will reshape European society for centuries to come. You're watching the birth of the modern world from the ashes of medieval civilization, forged in the crucible of humanity's greatest demographic catastrophe. You're walking through the abandoned village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire in 1350, your footsteps echoing through empty streets where grass already grows between the cobblestones. Just 2 years ago, this was a thriving agricultural community of perhaps 200 souls, with neat rows of peasant cottages, a small church, and fields of grain stretching to the horizon. Now it's a ghost town, its population either dead from plague or fled to seek survival elsewhere. The demographic impact of the Black Death creates thousands of such abandoned settlements across Europe. These lost villages represent one of the most visible consequences of the pandemic's devastating mortality. Archaeological excavations of these sites reveal the sudden nature of their abandonment: cooking pots left on hearths, tools abandoned. In fields, personal belongings scattered as if people simply vanished overnight. You examine the remains of a peasant cottage in Tusmore, where archaeologists have found evidence of the family's final days. Coins scattered on the floor suggest desperate attempts to purchase food or medicine. A child's wooden toy lies forgotten in a corner. Most poignantly, a hastily dug grave in the cottage's garden contains the remains of a woman and infant, probably buried by family members who lacked the strength to carry them to the village cemetery. The plague's impact on rural communities differs significantly from its urban effects, but proves equally devastating. Rural areas, with their dispersed populations and limited trade connections, initially seem safer from plague transmission. However, when the disease does arrive carried by fleeing city dwellers, traveling merchants, or infected animals rural, communities often lack the resources and knowledge to respond effectively. Here's a detail that reveals the interconnected nature of medieval rural life. The plague's arrival in one village often triggers a cascade of abandonment in surrounding communities. When key villages that serve as market centers or administrative hubs lose their populations, entire networks of rural settlements become economically unviable. The result is a pattern of demographic collapse that extends far beyond areas directly affected by plague mortality. The abandonment of agricultural land creates ecological changes that persist for centuries. Fields that have been cultivated for generations return to forest, while carefully maintained drainage systems collapse without human maintenance. Some areas of Europe experience significant reforestation during the post-plague period as nature reclaims abandoned farmland. These ecological changes become permanent features of the European landscape. You witness the transformation of surviving rural communities as they adapt to drastically reduced populations. Villages that lose 60 to 70% of their inhabitants must reorganize their social structures, agricultural practices, and governance systems. Traditional village hierarchies, based on established families and inherited status, give way to more fluid arrangements based on practical necessity and survival skills. The plague's impact on agricultural labor creates a revolution in farming practices and rural social relationships. With so many agricultural workers dead, surviving peasants find themselves in unprecedented demand. Landlords who previously could rely on bound labor from villein peasants must now compete for workers by offering higher wages, better working conditions, and greater personal freedom. The traditional manor system, which has organized English rural life for centuries, begins to collapse under the pressure of demographic change. Manors depend on large populations of peasant families working small plots of land in exchange for protection and the right to farm. When half the peasants die, the system becomes economically unsustainable. Some manors are abandoned entirely, while others undergo radical reorganization. You observe the emergence of new agricultural arrangements as surviving peasants negotiate better terms with desperate landlords. Some peasants abandon their traditional holdings entirely, moving to areas where landlords offer higher wages or more favorable lease terms. This mobility of agricultural labor, unthinkable in pre-plague England, represents a fundamental shift in rural social relationships. The Statute of Labourers, enacted by the English Parliament in 1351, attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent agricultural workers from moving between employers. The law reflects the landed elite's recognition that demographic change threatens their traditional economic advantages. However, the statute proves largely unenforceable. Basic economics of supply and demand cannot be legislated away when the supply of labor has been cut in half. The plague's impact on rural women creates both opportunities and challenges. With so many men dead, women often inherit land, assume responsibility for agricultural operations, and take on roles that would normally be reserved for males. However, this increased responsibility comes at the cost of enormous personal loss and social disruption. Rural women become crucial to community survival, while simultaneously bearing the emotional burden of caring for plague survivors. You witness the transformation of rural religious life as parish churches lose their priests and congregations. Some rural parishes are combined due to lack of clergy, while others are abandoned entirely. The physical churches often survive as monuments to vanished communities, their empty pews and silent bells serving as memorials to the plague's demographic impact. The plague's effect on rural inheritance patterns creates new forms of property, ownership, and land use. Traditional inheritance laws, which assume that property passes from parents to children over normal lifespans, prove inadequate when entire families die within weeks. Some rural communities develop simplified inheritance procedures that allow rapid transfer of land to surviving relatives, or community members. The consolidation of land holdings becomes a common feature of post-plague rural life. Survivors often inherit multiple properties from deceased relatives, creating larger agricultural units than existed before the plague. This consolidation sometimes leads to more efficient farming practices, but it also contributes to increased inequality between landowners and landless laborers. Here's a fascinating detail about post-plague agriculture. Some rural areas experience improvements in agricultural productivity despite reduced populations. With more land available per surviving farmer and less pressure on marginal soils, agricultural yields per capita sometimes increase. This improved productivity helps support post-plague population recovery and contributes to rising living standards. For survivors, the plague's impact on rural crafts and industries creates both losses and opportunities. Traditional craft knowledge, passed down through family lines, sometimes disappears when entire families die. However, the scarcity of skilled craftsmen also creates opportunities for survivors to learn new trades and command higher prices for their services. Some rural areas develop new craft specializations to replace lost urban production. You observe the emergence of new forms of rural community organization designed to provide mutual support for plague survivors. Cooperative farming arrangements, shared labor systems, and informal networks of mutual aid help surviving rural communities maintain basic agricultural production despite reduced populations. These arrangements often outlast the immediate plague crisis, becoming permanent features of rural social organization. The plague's effect on rural markets and trade networks creates lasting changes in regional economic patterns. Market towns that lose their populations and no longer serve as commercial centers for surrounding rural areas. Some rural regions become more isolated and self-sufficient, while others develop new trade connections to replace lost commercial relationships. The transformation of rural transportation networks reflects the plague's demographic impact. Roads and bridges that served abandoned villages fall into disrepair without communities to maintain them. Some rural areas become increasingly isolated as transportation infrastructure collapses, while others benefit from improved access to surviving market centers. You witness the development of new agricultural techniques and crop choices designed to maximize productivity with reduced labor inputs. Some rural areas shift from labor-intensive crops like wheat to less demanding alternatives like barley or oats. Others experiment with new farming methods that require fewer workers, but produce adequate yields for reduced populations. The plague's impact on rural education and literacy creates both losses and opportunities. Many rural schools close due to lack of teachers and students, but the social disruption also creates demand for new forms of education. Some rural communities develop innovative educational arrangements that combine practical training with basic literacy, preparing survivors for the changed economic conditions of post-plague society. The plague's effect on rural religious practices reveals the complex relationship between crisis and faith in medieval society. Some rural communities experience religious revival as survivors interpret their survival as divine blessing. Others lose faith entirely, abandoning traditional religious practices in favor of secular concerns. These divergent responses create lasting tensions within rural religious communities. The emergence of new rural settlement patterns reflects the plague's demographic impact and survivors' adaptation strategies. Some abandoned villages are partially reoccupied by survivors from multiple communities, creating new settlements with mixed populations and diverse traditions. Others remain permanently abandoned, becoming archaeological sites that preserve evidence of medieval rural life. You observe the development of new forms of rural governance designed to address the challenges of reduced populations and changed social relationships. Traditional village governance systems, based on established families and inherited authority, give way to more democratic arrangements that reflect the practical needs of plague survivors. These changes sometimes outlast the immediate crisis, contributing to long-term evolution of rural political structures. The plague's impact on rural culture and traditions creates both losses and innovations. Traditional folk practices, songs, and stories sometimes disappear when the families who maintain them die. However, the social disruption also creates opportunities for cultural innovation, as survivors from different communities share their traditions and create new forms of cultural expression. The transformation of rural landscapes becomes one of the most visible long-term consequences of the plague's demographic impact. Abandoned villages, overgrown fields, and collapsed infrastructure create new geographical patterns that persist for centuries. Some areas of Europe still show evidence of plague-era abandonment in their settlement patterns and land use arrangements. Perhaps, most significantly, the plague's impact on rural communities demonstrates the fundamental interconnectedness of medieval society. The demographic collapse of rural areas affects urban food supplies, while urban plague mortality disrupts rural markets and trade networks. The result is a comprehensive transformation of European civilization that extends far beyond the immediate medical crisis to reshape the basic structures of medieval life. You're witnessing not just demographic catastrophe, but the birth of new forms of rural community forged in the crucible of unprecedented mortality. The agricultural practices, social relationships, and settlement patterns that emerge from plague trauma represent humanity's remarkable capacity to adapt and survive even after the foundations of traditional life have been shattered. The rural communities that survive the Black Death often emerge more resilient and better adapted to changing conditions than their pre-plague predecessors. Asterisk, you're standing in the Guildhall of London in 1351, watching master craftsmen argue heatedly about wages, working conditions, and the rights of journeymen. The Great Hall, which normally hosts ceremonial occasions and formal guild meetings, has become a battlefield where traditional economic relationships are being torn apart and rebuilt. The Black Death has killed so many skilled workers that survivors find themselves in unprecedented demand, and they're not shy about leveraging their newfound power. The plague's impact on medieval labor markets creates the most dramatic economic transformation in European history. Before 1347, Europe's large population keeps wages low and working conditions harsh. Peasants are bound to their lord's land. Urban workers compete desperately for limited opportunities, and social mobility remains virtually impossible for most people. The Black Death changes everything by creating acute labor shortages that give surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power. You observe master craftsmen who previously could choose from dozens of eager apprentices now begging young men to learn their trades. Blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, weavers, and other skilled artisans find themselves competing for workers rather than workers competing for positions. This fundamental shift in labor market dynamics creates ripple effects throughout European society that will persist for generations. The guild system, which has dominated urban crafts for centuries, faces unprecedented challenges as traditional hierarchies collapse. Guilds have maintained strict controls over who can practice specific trades, how many apprentices masters can train, and what wages can be paid. But when half the guild members die, these restrictions become impossible to maintain. Some guilds relax their membership requirements, while others face extinction due to lack of members. Here's a detail. It reveals the plague's impact on craft knowledge. Many specialized skills that took decades to master disappear entirely when entire families of craftsmen die. The secret techniques for creating certain types of glass, metalwork, or textiles are lost forever, creating gaps in European technological capability that take generations to recover. Some crafts never return to their pre-plague levels of sophistication. The plague's effect on agricultural labor proves equally revolutionary. Surviving peasants, who have traditionally worked their lord's land in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots, suddenly find themselves in enormous demand. Some abandon their traditional holdings entirely, moving to areas where landlords offer higher wages or better working conditions. This mobility of agricultural labor represents a fundamental challenge to the feudal system. You witness the emergence of wage labor as a dominant form of economic relationship. Before the plague, most work is organized through feudal obligations, guild memberships, or family relationships. After the plague, cash wages become increasingly common as employers compete for scarce workers. This shift toward monetary relationships transforms European economic life and contributes to the development of market capitalism. The English government's response to these labor market changes reveals the tension between economic necessity and social tradition. The Statute of Laborers, 1351, attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving between employers. Similar laws are enacted across Europe as ruling elites recognize that demographic change threatens their traditional economic advantages. However, these wage control laws prove largely unenforceable. You can't legislate away the basic economics of supply and demand, especially when the supply of labor has been cut in half. Workers who are offered higher wages by competing employers simply ignore the legal restrictions. Some employers, desperate for workers, secretly offer wages above the legal limits while publicly supporting the wage control laws. The plague's impact on women's economic roles creates both opportunities and challenges. With so many men dead, women often assume responsibility for family businesses, inherit property, and take on economic roles that would normally be reserved for males. Some women become successful merchants, craft producers, or agricultural managers. However, this increased economic responsibility comes at the cost of enormous personal loss and social disruption. You observe the transformation of urban economies as cities adapt to drastically reduced populations. Some cities that lose 60 to 70% of their inhabitants must completely reorganize their economic structures. Traditional industries that depend on large workforces collapse, while new economic activities emerge to serve the needs of plague survivors. The result is a comprehensive transformation of European urban life. The plague's effect on international trade creates both disruptions and opportunities. Traditional trade routes are disrupted by plague mortality and economic collapse in key commercial centers. However, the demographic changes also create new patterns of demand and supply that generate opportunities for innovative merchants and traders. Some individuals and communities emerge from the plague wealthier than before, despite the overall economic devastation. The consolidation of wealth becomes a common feature of post-plague European society. Survivors often inherit multiple properties from deceased relatives, creating larger concentrations of wealth than existed before the plague. This consolidation sometimes leads to more efficient economic organization, but it also contributes to increased inequality between property owners and propertyless workers. Here's a fascinating economic detail. Some European regions experience improvements in living standards despite reduced populations. With more resources available per surviving person and less pressure on marginal lands, per capita wealth sometimes increases. This improved standard of living helps support post-plague population recovery and contributes to cultural developments that will eventually produce the Renaissance. The plague's impact on monetary systems reflects the broader economic disruption caused by demographic collapse. Some regions experience deflation as reduced populations decrease demand for goods and services. Others face inflation as labor shortages drive up production costs. These monetary fluctuations create additional challenges for economic recovery and contribute to political instability in some areas. You witness the emergence of new forms of business, organization designed to address the challenges of reduced populations and changed economic conditions. Partnerships, joint ventures, and cooperative arrangements become more common as survivors pool resources and expertise to maintain economic activity. These new organizational forms sometimes prove more efficient than traditional family-based businesses. The plague's effect on taxation and public finance creates significant challenges for medieval governments. Traditional tax systems, based on fixed populations and established economic relationships, prove inadequate when communities lose large portions of their inhabitants. Some governments must reduce tax rates to reflect reduced economic capacity, while others struggle to maintain basic public services with diminished revenues. The transformation of property markets reflects the plague's demographic impact and survivors' adaptation strategies. With so many properties abandoned or inherited by distant relatives, real estate markets become highly fluid. Some survivors acquire multiple properties at low prices, while others struggle to maintain inherited holdings without sufficient labor or resources. You observe the development of new credit and banking arrangements designed to address the financial needs of plague survivors. Traditional lending relationships, based on established families and long-term community ties, must be rebuilt when entire communities are disrupted. Some financial innovations that emerge during the post-plague period contribute to the development of more sophisticated banking systems. The plague's impact on technological innovation creates both losses and opportunities. Some technological knowledge disappears when the craftsmen who possessed it die. However, the scarcity of labor also creates incentives for developing labor-saving technologies and more efficient production methods. Some technological advances that emerge during the post-plague period contribute to long-term economic growth. The emergence of new consumption patterns reflects the changed economic conditions of post-plague Europe. Survivors with inherited wealth sometimes engage in conspicuous consumption, purchasing luxury goods and services that would have been unaffordable before the plague. This increased demand for luxury items creates opportunities for surviving craftsmen and merchants who can provide high-quality goods. You witness the transformation of educational and training systems as communities adapt to new economic realities. Traditional apprenticeship systems, which assumed stable populations and established craft hierarchies, must be modified when entire families of craftsmen die. Some communities develop innovative training programs that combine multiple skills or provide accelerated learning opportunities for plague survivors. The plague's effect on economic regulation reveals the challenges of maintaining traditional controls during demographic crisis. Guild regulations, price controls, and trade restrictions that worked with stable populations prove inadequate when economic relationships are fundamentally disrupted. Some regulatory systems adapt to new conditions, while others collapse entirely. Development of new economic theories and practices reflects medieval society's attempts to understand and manage the economic consequences of demographic catastrophe. Some scholars begin to develop more sophisticated understanding of labor markets, price mechanisms, and economic relationships. These intellectual developments contribute to the eventual emergence of modern economic thought. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's economic impact demonstrates the fundamental interconnectedness of medieval European society. Labor shortages in rural areas affect urban food supplies, while urban economic disruption impacts rural markets and trade networks. The result is a comprehensive transformation of European economic life that extends far beyond the immediate. Demographic crisis. You're witnessing not just economic disruption, but the birth of new forms of economic organization forged in the crucible of unprecedented demographic change. The labor relationships, business practices, and economic institutions that emerge from plague trauma represent humanity's remarkable capacity to adapt and innovate even after traditional economic structures have been shattered. The economic systems that survive the Black Death often prove more dynamic and responsive to changing conditions than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague's economic legacy extends far beyond the immediate crisis, creating conditions that will eventually contribute to the development of market capitalism, wage labor, and modern economic institutions. The demographic catastrophe that destroys medieval economic relationships also creates the foundation for new forms of economic organization that will dominate European development for centuries to come. Asterisk, you're kneeling in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. In Paris in 1349, surrounded by hundreds of other desperate souls seeking divine intervention against the plague. The massive Gothic structure, normally a symbol of divine order and human achievement, has become a refuge for people whose faith is being tested by incomprehensible suffering. The air is thick with incense, desperate prayers, and the underlying fear that perhaps God has abandoned his creation to the forces of darkness. The Black Death creates the most profound religious crisis in medieval European history. For a civilization that interprets all events through theological frameworks, the plague's devastating mortality raises fundamental questions about divine justice, human sin, and the nature of God's relationship with humanity. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why does he permit such unprecedented suffering? These questions challenge the very foundations of medieval Christian belief. You listen to the sermon of a Franciscan friar who attempts to explain the plague. Through traditional theological categories, he argues that the pestilence represents divine punishment for humanity's sins, pride, greed, lust, and other moral failings that have corrupted Christian society. This interpretation, while providing some explanatory framework, raises troubling questions about why innocent children and devout clergy die alongside obvious sinners. The plague's impact on the Catholic Church proves particularly devastating. Because clergy, who administer last rites and care for the sick, face constant exposure to infected individuals. Mortality rates among priests, monks, and nuns often exceed those of the general population. Some parishes lose their entire clergy, leaving communities without spiritual leadership during their greatest crisis. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's impact on religious authority. Many bishops and abbots died during the pandemic, creating succession crises that disrupt ecclesiastical administration. Some monasteries and convents are abandoned entirely when all their members die. The institutional church, which has provided stability and continuity for centuries, faces unprecedented organizational challenges. The plague's resistance to traditional religious remedies creates a crisis of faith that affects all levels of medieval society. Prayers, pilgrimages, relics, and other spiritual interventions that have traditionally provided comfort and healing prove powerless against bacterial infection. Some believers lose faith entirely, while others develop more intense religious devotion as they seek to appease divine wrath. You witness the emergence of new forms of religious expression, specifically related to plague, trauma, the flagellant movement, which spreads across Europe during the plague years, represents one of the most traumatic responses to the crisis. These groups of religious extremists travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves while chanting prayers and hymns, believing that self-inflicted suffering will appease God's anger and end the pestilence. The flagellant processions create both spiritual comfort and social disruption. Some communities welcome these penitents as holy men whose suffering might intercede for the general population. Others view them as dangerous fanatics whose extreme practices threaten social order. The church hierarchy generally opposes the flagellant movement, seeing it as a challenge to clerical authority and orthodox religious practice. The plague's impact on popular religious practices reveals the complex relationship between official church doctrine and folk Christianity. Many communities turn to local saints, miracle-working relics, and traditional folk remedies that blend Christian and pre-Christian elements. These practices, while officially discouraged by church authorities, provide psychological comfort for people facing unprecedented mortality. You observe the transformation of religious art and literature as medieval culture grapples with plague trauma. The memento mori, tradition artistic reminders of death's inevitability, becomes increasingly popular in post-plague Europe. Churches commission paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that emphasize human mortality and the need for spiritual preparation. These works serve both as artistic expression and psychological coping mechanisms for traumatized communities. The famous Dance of Death motif, which appears in churches and manuscripts across Europe, represents one of the most sophisticated artistic responses to plague trauma. These depictions show death as a skeleton, leading people from all social classes in a macabre dance toward the grave. The imagery serves as both warning and comfort, warning the living to prepare for death, while providing comfort through the recognition that death comes to everyone regardless of social status. The plague's impact on theological scholarship creates new debates about divine providence, human suffering, and the nature of evil. Some theologians develop more sophisticated theodicies explanations of how a good God can permit evil and suffering. Others question fundamental assumptions about divine justice and human responsibility. These theological developments contribute to intellectual changes that will eventually influence the Protestant Reformation. The crisis of clerical authority during the plague creates opportunities for lay religious movements and mystical traditions. With many priests dead and church institutions disrupted, some lay people assume greater responsibility for religious life in their communities. This increased lay participation in religious activities challenges traditional hierarchies and contributes to long-term changes in Christian practice. You witness the emergence of new saints and religious cults, specifically related to plague. Experience. Some individuals who care for plague victims or demonstrate exceptional faith during the crisis are venerated as saints by their communities. These new religious figures often represent more accessible and immediate forms of divine intervention than traditional saints, whose lives seem remote from contemporary experience. The plague's impact on pilgrimage practices reflects broader changes. In medieval religious life, some traditional pilgrimage sites are abandoned due to plague mortality, while others become more popular as desperate believers seek miraculous intervention. The famous pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela experiences significant disruption, while new local pilgrimage sites emerge to serve communities that cannot travel to distant shrines. The transformation of religious education and clerical training reflects the Church's need to replace clergy lost to plague mortality. Some seminaries and cathedral schools develop accelerated training programs to ordain new priests quickly. However, this rapid training sometimes results in lower educational standards and reduced clerical competence, contributing to long-term problems in church administration. Here's a fascinating detail about plague-era religious practices. Some communities develop new liturgical ceremonies specifically designed to address plague conditions. These services, which might include special prayers for plague victims, blessing of protective amulets, or communal acts of penance, represent medieval Christianity's attempts to adapt traditional religious practices to unprecedented circumstances. Plague's effect on religious architecture reveals both the crisis and recovery of medieval faith. Some church construction projects are abandoned when communities lose their populations or financial resources. Others are completed as acts of thanksgiving by plague survivors. The result is a complex pattern of architectural development that reflects the varied impact of plague on different communities. The emergence of new religious orders and confraternities during the post-plague period reflects both spiritual renewal and practical necessity. Some religious communities are founded specifically to care for plague orphans, tend to the sick, or provide burial services for the dead. These organizations often outlast the immediate plague crisis, becoming permanent features of European religious life. You observe the development of new forms of religious literature designed to address plague trauma and spiritual crisis. Treatises on preparing for death, guides to spiritual comfort during suffering, and theological explanations of divine justice become popular among educated believers. These works represent medieval Christianity's intellectual response to unprecedented challenges to faith. The plague's impact on religious music and liturgy creates both losses and innovations. Some traditional chants and ceremonies are modified or abandoned when the clergy who maintained them die. However, the spiritual intensity of plague experience also inspires new forms of religious expression, including hymns, prayers, and liturgical innovations that reflect contemporary spiritual needs. The transformation of confession and penance practices reflects the practical challenges of maintaining religious life during demographic crisis. With many priests dead, some communities develop alternative forms of spiritual counsel and absolution. These innovations, while sometimes controversial, help maintain religious practice when traditional clerical services are unavailable. The plague's effect on religious calendar and seasonal observances reveals the disruption of normal religious rhythms. Traditional feast days, seasonal celebrations, and liturgical cycles are modified or abandoned when communities lack the population or resources to maintain them. Some religious observances never recover their pre-plague significance, while others become more important as focal points for community identity. You witness the emergence of new theological interpretations of suffering and redemption that attempt to make sense of plague experience within Christian frameworks. Some theologians develop more sophisticated understanding of how individual and collective suffering might serve divine purposes. These theological developments contribute to long-term evolution of Christian thought about pain, death, and divine justice. The plague's impact on religious authority creates lasting changes in the relationship between clergy and laity. The failure of traditional religious remedies to prevent plague mortality undermines clerical claims to special spiritual power. Some communities develop more egalitarian religious practices that emphasize direct relationship with God rather than clerical mediation. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's religious impact demonstrates the complex relationship between crisis and faith in medieval society. While some believers lose faith entirely, others develop more intense religious devotion. The result is a diversification of religious experience that contributes to long-term changes in European Christianity, including developments that will eventually influence the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation. You're witnessing not just religious crisis, but the birth of new forms of Christian faith forged in the crucible of unprecedented suffering. The theological insights, religious practices, and spiritual institutions that emerge from plague trauma represent humanity's remarkable capacity to find meaning and hope, even in the face of incomprehensible loss. The religious communities that survive the Black Death often emerge with deeper, more resilient faith than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague's religious legacy extends far beyond the immediate crisis, creating spiritual and intellectual conditions that will influence European Christianity for centuries to come. The theological questions raised by plague experience continue to challenge Christian thinkers, while the religious innovations developed during the crisis contribute to the ongoing evolution of Christian faith and practice. You're standing in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena in 1348, watching city officials frantically attempt to maintain basic government functions as the plague devastates their population. The elegant frescoes depicting good and bad government that adorn the council chamber seem to mock the reality of a city where normal governance has become impossible. Half the city councilors are dead, tax collection has collapsed, and the elaborate system of checks and balances that has governed this Italian city-state for generations is crumbling under the weight of demographic catastrophe. The Black Death creates unprecedented challenges for medieval political systems across Europe. Governments designed for stable populations and established social hierarchies prove inadequate when communities lose 30 to 60% of their inhabitants within months. Traditional forms of political authority based on hereditary rights, established institutions, and social consensus face fundamental challenges when the very foundations of society are swept away by pandemic mortality. You observe the collapse of the Sienese government as key officials die faster than they can be replaced. The complex system of rotating magistrates, balanced representation from different social classes, and elaborate procedural safeguards that has made Siena one of Europe's most sophisticated republics becomes impossible to maintain when there simply aren't enough qualified people to fill essential positions. The plague's impact on royal governments proves equally disruptive. Kings and nobles, despite their wealth and supposed divine protection, die at rates comparable to their subjects. The English royal family loses several members to the plague, while the French monarchy faces succession crisis as potential heirs succumb to the disease. These royal deaths create political instability that compounds the social and economic disruption caused by general demographic collapse. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's impact on political legitimacy. Many medieval governments derive their authority from claims about divine favor, hereditary rights, or traditional customs. When these governments prove powerless to protect their subjects from plague mortality, their legitimacy comes under question. Some rulers lose political support, not because of policy failures, but because they cannot fulfill the basic governmental function of protecting their people's lives. The plague's effect on law enforcement and judicial systems creates widespread social disorder. With many judges, bailiffs, and other legal officials dead, courts cannot function normally. Some communities experience complete breakdowns of law and order as criminal justice systems collapse. Others develop informal mechanisms for maintaining social control, but these often lack the authority and consistency of traditional legal institutions. You witness the emergence of new forms of political organization designed to address the challenges of reduced populations and disrupted social structures. Some communities develop more democratic governance systems that reflect the practical needs of plague survivors rather than traditional hierarchies. Others experiment with emergency powers and simplified administrative procedures that can function with fewer officials. The plague's impact on taxation and public finance creates significant challenges for all levels of government. Traditional tax systems, based on fixed populations and established economic relationships, prove inadequate. When communities lose large portions of their inhabitants, some governments must reduce tax rates to reflect reduced economic capacity, while others struggle to maintain basic public services with diminished revenues. The transformation of military systems reflects the plague's demographic impact and changing political conditions. Traditional feudal military service, based on obligations tied to land ownership, becomes difficult to maintain when many landholders die. Some rulers must rely increasingly on mercenary forces, while others develop new forms of military organization that reflect post-plague social conditions. You observe the rise of new political leaders who gain power through their ability to manage plague-related crises rather than through traditional claims to authority. Some individuals who demonstrate competence in organizing plague response, maintaining food supplies, or preserving social order emerge as political leaders despite lacking hereditary or institutional claims to power. The plague's effect on international relations creates both conflicts and opportunities. Some wars are suspended or abandoned when armies are decimated by plague mortality. Others intensify as weakened states become vulnerable to attack by less affected neighbors. A complex web of alliances, treaties, and diplomatic relationships that has structured European politics for generations must be rebuilt in the aftermath of demographic catastrophe that the 100 Years' War between England and France experiences. Significant disruption due to plague mortality. Military campaigns are suspended when armies cannot be maintained, while the demographic collapse in both countries reduces their capacity for sustained warfare. However, the war eventually resumes with new intensity as both sides seek to exploit their opponents' plague-related weaknesses. The plague's impact on the Holy Roman Empire creates particular challenges due to the empire's complex federal structure. With many princes, bishops, and other territorial rulers dead, the elaborate system of checks and balances that has prevented imperial centralization begins to break down. Some emperors attempt to use plague-related disruption to increase their power, while others find their authority further weakened by demographic collapse. Here's a fascinating political detail. Some European cities and regions experience improvements in governance despite plague mortality. With reduced populations and simplified social structures, some communities develop more efficient administrative systems. The elimination of competing factions through plague mortality sometimes allows for more unified and effective political leadership. The plague's effect on the Catholic Church's political power creates lasting changes in European governance. The Church, which has served as a major political force throughout medieval Europe, faces significant challenges as clergy die at high rates and ecclesiastical institutions are disrupted. Some secular rulers use plague-related church weakness to assert greater independence from papal authority. You witness the emergence of new forms of political legitimacy based on practical competence rather than traditional authority. Leaders who can maintain food supplies, organize plague response, or preserve social order gain popular support, regardless of their hereditary claims or institutional positions. This shift toward performance-based legitimacy contributes to long-term changes in European political culture. The plague's impact on urban governance reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of medieval city-states. Cities with sophisticated administrative systems and diversified economies sometimes weather the plague crisis better than those dependent on single industries or traditional hierarchies. However, even the most advanced urban governments struggle to maintain normal functions when they lose large portions of their populations. A transformation of rural governance reflects the collapse of traditional manorial systems and feudal relationships. With many lords dead and peasant populations drastically reduced, the elaborate system of mutual obligations that has organized rural life for centuries becomes unsustainable. Some rural areas develop new forms of self-governance, while others fall under the control of surviving nobles who consolidate multiple holdings. The plague's effect on representative institutions creates both challenges and opportunities for political development. Some parliaments and assemblies cannot function when their members die faster than they can be replaced. Others adapt by modifying their procedures, reducing their membership requirements, or expanding representation to include new social groups that have gained importance during the crisis. You observe the development of new approaches to public health and social welfare that reflect government's attempts to address plague-related challenges. Some cities develop quarantine procedures, burial regulations, and food distribution systems that represent early forms of public health administration. These innovations often outlast the immediate plague crisis, becoming permanent features of governmental responsibility. The plague's impact on legal systems creates both disruptions and innovations. Traditional legal procedures, which assume stable populations and established social relationships, prove inadequate when communities are fundamentally disrupted. Some legal systems develop simplified procedures for property transfer, inheritance, disputes, and criminal justice that reflect the realities of post-plague society. The emergence of new forms of international cooperation reflects the shared challenges created by plague mortality. Some regions develop cooperative arrangements for trade, defense, or plague response that transcend traditional political boundaries. These innovations sometimes contribute to broader political developments, including the eventual emergence of more unified territorial states. The plague's effect on political theory and intellectual development creates new approaches to understanding government and authority. Some scholars begin to develop more sophisticated theories about the relationship between rulers and subjects, the purposes of government, and the sources of political legitimacy. These intellectual developments contribute to long-term evolution of European political thought. You witness the transformation of succession practices and inheritance laws as traditional systems prove inadequate for managing rapid population turnover. Some political systems develop new procedures for transferring power when entire ruling families die, while others modify their inheritance laws to address the practical challenges of plague-related mortality. The plague's impact on political communication and information systems reveals the importance of maintaining governmental functions during crisis. Traditional methods of communication between different levels of government break down when key officials die or administrative systems collapse. Some governments develop new communication procedures that can function with reduced personnel and disrupted institutions. The development of emergency powers and crisis management procedures reflects government's attempts to maintain authority during unprecedented challenges. Some rulers assume extraordinary powers to address plague-related problems, while others delegate authority to local officials who can respond more quickly to immediate needs. These emergency measures sometimes become permanent features of governmental systems. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's political impact demonstrates the fundamental relationship between demographic stability and governmental effectiveness. Political systems that have evolved over centuries to manage stable populations prove inadequate when those populations are suddenly reduced by half. The result is a comprehensive transformation of European political life that extends far beyond immediate medical crisis. You're witnessing not just political disruption, but the birth of new forms of governance, forged in the crucible of unprecedented demographic change. The political institutions, practices, and theories that emerge from plague trauma represent humanity's remarkable capacity to rebuild governmental systems even after traditional political structures have been shattered. The political systems that survive the Black Death often prove more adaptable and responsive to changing conditions than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague's political legacy extends far beyond the immediate crisis, creating institutional and intellectual conditions that will influence European political development for centuries to come. The governmental innovations developed during the plague crisis contribute to the eventual emergence of more centralized territorial states, more sophisticated administrative systems, and new theories of political authority that will dominate European development throughout the early modern period. You're walking through the abandoned scriptorium of the Abbey of St. Denis near Paris in 1349, where dust motes dance in the pale light filtering through stained glass windows. The wooden desks where monks once labored over illuminated manuscripts stand empty, their surfaces still bearing traces of gold leaf and colored inks. Half-finished books lie open, their pages curling at the edges. A Gospel of Matthew with an unfinished border of intricate vines. A treatise on astronomy with calculations that will never be completed. the Black Death's impact on medieval intellectual and cultural life proves as devastating as its demographic toll. Europe's monasteries, universities, and cathedral schools, the repositories of learning that have preserved and transmitted knowledge for centuries, face catastrophic losses as scholars, scribes, and teachers die faster than they can be replaced. You're witnessing the near collapse of medieval Europe's intellectual infrastructure. The plague's effect on manuscript production creates irreplaceable cultural losses. Medieval books, painstakingly copied by hand, and often taking months or years to complete, represent enormous investments of time, skill, and resources. When the scribes who create these works die, not only are current projects abandoned, but the specialized knowledge required for their production often dies with them. You examine a partially completed Book of Hours, its margins decorated with delicate illustrations of seasonal activities, peasants harvesting grain, nobles hunting deer, scholars reading in gardens. The artist's brush strokes end abruptly mid-flower, as if he simply vanished while working. Archaeological evidence from monastery scriptoriums across Europe reveals similar scenes of interrupted creativity, frozen moments where death intervened. In the act of cultural creation, here's a detail that reveals the plague's impact on intellectual continuity. Many specialized forms of knowledge that require years of training disappear entirely when entire communities of practitioners die. The techniques for creating certain types of illuminated manuscripts, the methods for calculating complex astronomical observations, the procedures for copying and preserving ancient texts, so all of these intellectual traditions face extinction when their practitioners succumb to plague mortality. The University of Paris, Europe's premier center of theological and philosophical learning, loses approximately half its faculty and students during the plague years. The sophisticated scholastic debates that have dominated European intellectual life for generations become impossible to maintain when the scholars who participate in them are dead. Some fields of study, particularly specialized areas of theology, natural philosophy, and mathematics nearly disappear from European intellectual life. You witness the transformation of educational systems as surviving institutions adapt to drastically reduced populations. Some universities combine faculties or eliminate entire programs when they lack sufficient teachers and students. Others modify their curricula to focus on practical skills needed for post-plague recovery rather than the abstract theoretical knowledge that has traditionally dominated medieval education. The plague's impact on legal scholarship creates particular challenges because medieval law depends on continuous tradition and accumulated precedent. When many legal scholars die, the sophisticated understanding of canon law, civil law, and local customs that has developed over centuries faces disruption. Some legal traditions are lost entirely, while others must be reconstructed from fragmentary sources by surviving scholars. The disruption of cathedral schools, which have served as centers of learning throughout medieval Europe, creates gaps in educational opportunity that persist for generations. These schools, typically attached to major churches and staffed by educated clergy, provide basic education for future priests, government officials, and merchants. When plague mortality devastates the clergy, many cathedral schools close permanently. You observe the emergence of new forms of intellectual activity as plague. Survivors attempt to make sense of their experience. Some scholars begin writing chronicles, treatises, and theological works specifically addressing plague-related questions. These works, while often embedded in traditional medieval frameworks, represent attempts to understand unprecedented historical experience through available intellectual tools. The plague's effect on artistic production creates both losses and innovations. Many artistic projects are abandoned when their creators die, but the social disruption also creates demand for new forms of artistic expression that address plague trauma and social change. The famous memento mori tradition, artistic reminders of death's inevitability, becomes increasingly popular in post-plague Europe. The transformation of musical traditions reflects broader cultural changes caused by plague mortality. Many forms of liturgical music that depend on trained choirs and sophisticated musical knowledge are simplified or abandoned when the musicians who perform them die. However, the emotional intensity of plague experience also inspires new forms of musical expression, including hymns, laments, and popular songs that reflect contemporary spiritual and social concerns. Here's a fascinating cultural detail. Some European regions experience cultural renaissance despite plague mortality. With traditional authorities weakened and social hierarchies disrupted, some communities develop more innovative and experimental approaches to art, literature, and intellectual activity. The demographic catastrophe that destroys established cultural institutions also creates opportunities for cultural innovation. The plague's impact on vernacular literature creates new opportunities for non-Latin literary expression. With many Latin-educated clergy dead, there's increased demand for literature written in local languages that can be understood by broader populations. This shift contributes to the development of national literatures and the gradual decline of Latin as the dominant language of European intellectual life. You witness the emergence of new literary themes and genres specifically related to plague experience. Works like Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, which frames its collection of stories within the context of plague-ravaged Florence, represent sophisticated attempts to process trauma through literary expression. These works often blend traditional literary forms with contemporary social observation and psychological insight. The plague's effect on historical writing creates both challenges and opportunities. Many chronicle traditions are interrupted when their monastic or clerical authors die, creating gaps in historical records that persist to this day. However, the unprecedented nature of plague experience also motivates some survivors to document their experiences, producing historical accounts that provide invaluable evidence about medieval life and plague impact. The transformation of philosophical and theological scholarship reflects the intellectual challenges created by plague experience. Traditional medieval philosophy, which emphasizes divine order, rational explanation, and systematic understanding, faces challenges when confronted with apparently meaningless mass mortality. Some scholars develop new approaches to questions about suffering, divine justice, and human knowledge that reflect plague-era concerns. The plague's impact on scientific and medical knowledge creates complex patterns of loss and innovation. Many medical texts and traditions are lost when their practitioners die, but the plague's challenge to traditional medical authority also creates opportunities for new approaches to understanding disease and natural phenomena. Some plague-era medical observations represent significant advances in empirical knowledge, even when embedded in incorrect theoretical frameworks. You observe the development of new forms of cultural patronage as social structures change in the aftermath of plague mortality. Some plague survivors who inherit multiple properties become wealthy enough to support artistic and intellectual activities. However, the social disruption also reduces the number of potential patrons and changes the types of cultural activities that receive support. The plague's effect on library collections and book preservation creates lasting cultural losses. Many monastic and cathedral libraries are abandoned when their communities die, leaving valuable manuscripts vulnerable to decay, theft, or destruction. Some collections are dispersed when surviving books are sold to raise money for plague relief or other urgent needs. The emergence of new educational institutions reflects post-plague society's need for different types of knowledge and training. Some communities establish schools focused on practical skills needed for economic recovery, while others create new forms of religious education designed to address spiritual needs created by plague trauma. These educational innovations sometimes prove more effective than traditional institutions. The plague's impact on cultural exchange and communication creates both barriers and opportunities. Traditional networks for sharing ideas, texts, and artistic innovations are disrupted by plague, mortality, and social upheaval. However, the demographic changes also create new patterns of cultural contact as survivors migrate, communities merge, and social boundaries become more fluid. You witness the transformation of cultural memory and collective identity as communities attempt to preserve their heritage despite massive population losses. Some communities develop new traditions and commemorative practices designed to maintain continuity with their pre-plague past. Others embrace change and innovation, using the opportunity created by social disruption to develop new forms of cultural expression. The plague's effect on language and linguistic development reflects broader social changes caused by demographic upheaval. Some regional dialects and linguistic traditions disappear when their speakers die, while others spread to new areas as survivors migrate and communities merge. The social disruption also accelerates changes in vocabulary, grammar, and linguistic usage that reflect new social realities. The development of new forms of cultural production reflects both the losses and opportunities created by plague experience. Some survivors become cultural innovators by necessity, developing new artistic techniques, literary forms, or intellectual approaches to replace lost traditions. Others focus on preservation, attempting to maintain cultural continuity despite reduced resources and disrupted institutions. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's cultural impact demonstrates the fundamental relationship between demographic stability and cultural continuity. Cultural traditions that have developed over centuries prove vulnerable to sudden population loss, while new forms of cultural expression emerge from the social conditions created by demographic catastrophe. The result is a comprehensive transformation of European cultural life that extends far beyond immediate medical crisis. You're witnessing not just cultural destruction, but the birth of new forms of intellectual and artistic expression forged in the crucible of unprecedented social change. The cultural innovations that emerge from plague trauma represent humanity's remarkable capacity to create meaning and beauty, even in the aftermath of devastating loss. The cultural traditions that survived the Black Death often prove more resilient and adaptable than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague's cultural legacy extends far beyond the immediate crisis, creating intellectual and artistic conditions that will influence European cultural development for centuries to come. The cultural innovations developed during the plague crisis contribute to broader developments, including the Renaissance. the Protestant Reformation, and the emergence of modern European cultural traditions. Asterisk, you're standing on the docks of Venice. In 1348, watching a merchant galley from Constantinople slowly make its way into the lagoon. The ship flies the yellow flag that signals disease aboard, and you can see bodies being thrown overboard, even as the vessel approaches the harbor. This scene, repeated in ports across the Mediterranean, represents a turning point in global trade networks that have connected civilizations for millennia. The Black Death's impact on international commerce creates the most significant disruption of global trade networks in recorded history. The plague spreads along the very routes that have brought prosperity to medieval Europe. The Silk Road connecting Asia to the Mediterranean, the maritime networks linking Europe with Africa and the Middle East, and the overland routes that tie together the continent's major commercial centers. You observe the collapse of the Silk Road trade system as plague mortality devastates key trading cities from Kaffa to Samarkand. This ancient network, which has facilitated the exchange of silk, spices, precious stones, and exotic manufactures for over a millennium, faces unprecedented disruption when the merchants, craftsmen, and transport workers who maintain it die. In massive numbers, the great trading cities of Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent experience demographic collapses that effectively end their roles as commercial intermediaries between East and West. These cities, which have grown wealthy by facilitating trade between China, India, Persia, and Europe, find their populations so reduced that they can no longer maintain the complex commercial relationships that have sustained them for centuries. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's impact on global commerce. Chinese porcelain and silk found in European archaeological sites from the 14th century show a sharp decline in quality and quantity after 1350. This suggests that the plague's disruption of trade networks affects manufacturing and commerce across the entire breadth of Eurasia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The plague's effect on Mediterranean trade creates lasting changes in European commercial relationships. Venice and Genoa, the great Italian maritime republics that have dominated Eastern Mediterranean commerce, face severe challenges as their trading partners in Constantinople, Alexandria, and other eastern ports experience plague-related demographic and economic collapse. You witness the transformation of European banking and finance as traditional commercial relationships are disrupted by plague mortality. The great banking houses of Florence, Siena, and other Italian cities, which have extended credit networks across Europe and into Asia, face massive defaults when their borrowers die or their businesses collapse. Some banking firms that have operated for generations disappear entirely during the plague years. The famous Bardi and Peruzzi banks of Florence, which have financed everything from English wool exports to Eastern spice imports, face bankruptcy as their far-flung commercial networks collapse. The failure of these financial institutions creates ripple effects throughout European commerce, making credit scarce and international trade more difficult even in regions not directly affected by plague mortality. The plague's impact on the wool trade between England and Flanders demonstrates how demographic collapse can disrupt entire industries. English wool production, which has been the foundation of the country's export economy, faces severe challenges when plague mortality reduces both the agricultural workforce needed to tend sheep and the urban populations that process and consume. Woolen textiles. The Flemish textile cities, Bruges, Ghent, Yprowich have grown wealthy by processing English wool into finished cloth, experience their own plague-related disruptions. The sophisticated craft knowledge required for high quality. Textile production is lost when entire families of skilled workers die. Some textile centers never recovered their pre-plague production, levels, or market positions. You observe the emergence of new trade routes and commercial relationships as merchants adapt to plague-related disruptions. Some traders abandon traditional routes that pass through heavily infected areas, developing alternative pathways that avoid the worst plague zones. Others exploit the commercial opportunities created when established trading relationships collapse. The plague's effect on monetary systems and currency exchange creates additional challenges for international commerce. Some regions experience deflation as reduced populations decrease demand for goods and services, while others face inflation as labor shortages drive up production costs. These monetary fluctuations make international trade more risky and complicated, requiring new forms of financial innovation. The disruption of traditional commercial law and trading customs creates uncertainty that further inhibits international commerce. Commercial relationships that have been governed by established customs, guild regulations, and international agreements must be renegotiated when the institutions that enforce these arrangements are weakened or destroyed by plague mortality. Here's a fascinating commercial detail. Some European merchants who survived the plague emerge wealthier than before, despite the overall economic devastation. By consolidating the business interests of deceased competitors, exploiting new trading opportunities, or adapting quickly to changed market conditions, these survivors sometimes achieve commercial success that would have been impossible under pre-plague conditions. The plague's impact on transportation infrastructure creates lasting barriers to commercial recovery. Roads, bridges, and port facilities that require constant maintenance fall into disrepair when the communities responsible for their upkeep lose large portions of their populations. Some traditional trade routes become impassable, forcing merchants to develop new transportation networks. You witness the transformation of commercial practices as traders adapt to the uncertainties created by plague-related disruptions. Some merchants begin requiring cash payments rather than extending credit, reducing their exposure to losses from borrower mortality. Others develop new forms of insurance and risk-sharing arrangements designed to address the increased dangers of plague-era commerce. The plague's effect on craft production and manufacturing creates both shortages and opportunities in international markets. Traditional manufacturing centers that lose their skilled workforces can no longer produce the high-quality goods that have made them famous. However, this creates opportunities for surviving producers to capture market share and command higher prices for their products. The disruption of traditional apprenticeship systems affects the transmission of commercial knowledge and skills across generations. Many trading families that have maintained commercial relationships for centuries lose their accumulated expertise when entire generations die. Some commercial techniques and market knowledge disappear entirely, while others must be reconstructed by survivors with incomplete information. The plague's impact on commercial communication networks creates additional challenges for international trade. The systems of correspondence, credit instruments, and market information that have facilitated long-distance commerce are disrupted when the merchants, bankers, and clerks who maintain them die. Some commercial relationships that have existed for generations are lost when the personal connections that sustain them are severed by death. you observe the development of new commercial institutions and practices designed to address the challenges created by plague-related disruptions. Some trading cities established new forms of commercial courts, market regulations, and trading procedures that can function with reduced populations and simplified administrative systems. The plague's effect on luxury goods markets creates interesting patterns of consumption and production. Some luxury items become more expensive and rare as their producers die or their supply chains are disrupted. Others become more accessible to plague survivors who inherit wealth from deceased relatives, creating new patterns of demand for high quality goods and services. The transformation of agricultural trade reflects the plague's impact on food production and in distribution systems. Traditional patterns of grain trade, which have supplied urban populations and connected rural surplus areas with food deficit regions, must be rebuilt when demographic changes alter both production capacity and consumption needs. The plague's impact on technological transfer and innovation creates both losses and opportunities. Some technological knowledge that has spread along trade routes is lost when the craftsmen who possess it die. However, the disruption of traditional commercial relationships also creates incentives for technological innovation as survivors seek new ways to maintain production with reduced labor forces. You witness the emergence of new commercial partnerships and business organizations as survivors attempt to rebuild disrupted trading networks. Some merchants form new alliances that combine the resources and expertise of multiple families or communities. Others develop innovative business structures that can operate effectively despite reduced populations and uncertain market conditions. The plague's effect on commercial law and dispute resolution creates challenges that persist long after the immediate health crisis passes. Traditional mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes, guild courts, merchant tribunals, international arbitration, must be rebuilt or modified when the legal experts and institutional structures that supported them are weakened by plague. Mortality. The development of new forms of commercial credit and finance reflects merchants' attempts to address the increased risks of plague-era trade. Some financial innovations that emerged during this period, including new forms of insurance, risk-sharing arrangements, and credit instruments, contribute to the long-term development of more sophisticated commercial finance systems. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's impact on global trade demonstrates the fundamental interconnectedness of medieval commercial systems and their vulnerability to demographic disruption. Trade networks that have connected civilizations across continents prove fragile when the human relationships that sustain them are severed by mass mortality. You're witnessing not just commercial disruption, but the birth of new forms of international trade forged in the aftermath of unprecedented demographic change. The commercial innovations that emerge from plague-related disruptions represent humanity's remarkable capacity to rebuild economic relationships even after traditional trading systems have been shattered. The commercial networks that survive the Black Death often prove more resilient and adaptable than their pre-plague predecessors. The plague's commercial legacy extends far beyond the immediate crisis, creating economic conditions that will influence global trade development for centuries to come. The commercial innovations developed during the plague crisis contribute to broader developments including the age of exploration, the emergence of global capitalism, and the creation of modern international trade systems. Asterisk, you're walking through the streets of Florence in 1350, 2 years after the plague's peak mortality, and the city feels like a ghost of its former self. The magnificent palazzos still stand, their stone facades as impressive as ever, but many bear wooden boards over their windows and doors, bearing the painted marks indicating properties of the deceased. The narrow medieval streets, once crowded, with merchants, craftsmen, and pilgrims, now echo with your footsteps as you pass abandoned shops and empty market stalls. The long-term consequences of the Black Death extend far beyond the immediate medical crisis, creating demographic, social, and economic changes that reshape European civilization for centuries. You're witnessing the birth of the early modern world from the ashes of medieval society, though the full implications of these transformations won't become clear for generations. The demographic recovery from plague mortality proves slower and more complex than anyone anticipates. While some regions begin to see population growth within a generation, others remain significantly underpopulated for over a century. The uneven pattern of recovery creates new geographical patterns of settlement, economic activity, and political power that persist into the modern era. You observe the emergence of new social structures as plague survivors adapt to permanently changed demographic conditions. The rigid hierarchies of medieval society, based on birth, land ownership, and traditional authority, give way to more fluid arrangements where practical skills, accumulated wealth, and personal competence matter more than hereditary status. Transformation of labor relations becomes one of the plague's most lasting legacies. The acute labor shortages created by plague mortality give surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power that they're reluctant to surrender even as populations begin to recover. The concept of wage labor, which becomes common during the plague crisis, evolves into a permanent feature of European economic life. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's long-term impact on social mobility. Many European families that achieve prominence in the 15th and 16th centuries trace their rise to opportunities created by plague-related demographic changes. The consolidation of property, the availability of economic niches vacated by plague victims, and the breakdown of traditional barriers to advancement create unprecedented opportunities for social climbing. The plague's impact on agricultural systems creates lasting changes in European farming practices and rural social organization. The abundance of available land and the scarcity of agricultural workers encourage the development of more intensive farming methods, larger agricultural units, and more efficient production techniques. Some of these innovations contribute to the agricultural improvements that will eventually support early modern population growth. You witness the transformation of urban life as cities adapt to permanently reduced populations. Some cities that lose 60 to 70% of their inhabitants during the plague never fully recover their pre-plague size or importance. Others use the opportunity created by demographic change to reorganize their physical layout, economic activities, and social structures in ways that make them more efficient and livable. The plague's effect on political development contributes to the emergence of more centralized and efficient governmental systems. The breakdown of traditional feudal relationships and the need for effective crisis management during the plague years encouraged the development of more professional administrative systems and stronger central authority. These changes contribute to the eventual emergence of the modern European state system. The transformation of religious life creates lasting changes in European Christianity that influence both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The crisis of clerical authority during the plague years combined with increased lay participation in religious life, creates conditions that make later religious reforms more likely and more successful. The plague's impact on intellectual life contributes to the cultural developments that will eventually produce the Renaissance. The breakdown of traditional scholastic authority, the increased availability of patronage for surviving scholars and artists, and the psychological need to make sense of unprecedented historical experience all contribute to new forms of cultural expression and intellectual inquiry. You observe the development of new approaches to public health and social welfare that represent early forms of modern governmental responsibility. The quarantine procedures, burial regulations, and food distribution systems developed during the plague crisis evolve into permanent features of urban administration. These innovations represent some of the first systematic attempts at public health management in European history. The plague's effect on international relations creates new patterns of conflict and cooperation that influence European political development for centuries. The demographic changes caused by plague mortality alter the balance of power between different regions and political entities, contributing to new forms of international competition and alliance formation. The transformation of economic systems contributes to the development of more sophisticated forms of capitalism and market organization. The breakdown of traditional guild systems, the increased importance of monetary relationships, and the need for new forms of commercial organization all contribute to economic innovations that will eventually produce modern market economies. Here's a fascinating long-term consequence. The plague's impact on European demographics may have contributed to the age of exploration and European colonial expansion. The demographic recovery from plague mortality creates population pressures that encourage overseas expansion, while the economic and technological innovations developed during the post-plague period provide the tools necessary for long-distance exploration and colonization. The plague's influence on legal systems creates lasting changes in European law and jurisprudence. The simplified legal procedures developed during the plague crisis, combined with new approaches to property rights and inheritance law, contribute to the development of more flexible and responsive legal systems that better serve the needs of changing societies. You witness the emergence of new forms of cultural expression that reflect the psychological and social changes created by plague experience. The increased concern with mortality, the questioning of traditional authority, and the emphasis on individual experience that characterize post-plague European culture contribute to artistic and literary developments that will define Renaissance and early modern cultural expression. The plague's impact on gender roles and family structures creates lasting changes in European social organization. The increased economic opportunities for women during the plague crisis, combined with changes in inheritance patterns and family formation, contribute to gradual modifications in gender relationships that influence European social development. For centuries, the transformation of educational systems reflects the need for new forms of knowledge and training in post-plague society. The emphasis on practical skills, the development of vernacular education, and the creation of new educational institutions all contribute to changes in European intellectual life that support later cultural and economic developments. The plague's effect on technological development creates both losses and innovations that influence European technological progress. While some traditional craft knowledge is lost, the labor shortages and economic pressures created by plague mortality also encourage technological innovation and the development of labor-saving devices that contribute to long-term economic growth. Observe the development of new forms of social organization and community structure that reflect the changed conditions of post-plague society. The mutual aid societies, religious confraternities, and neighborhood organizations that emerge to support plague survivors often become permanent features of European social life, contributing to the development of civil society institutions. Plague's influence on European attitudes toward disease and medical care creates lasting changes in approaches to health and healing. The failure of traditional medical remedies during the plague crisis encouraged more empirical approaches to medical knowledge, while the experience of managing epidemic disease contributes to the development of more sophisticated public health. Practices dot the transformation of commercial and financial systems creates the foundation for later economic developments, including the emergence of global capitalism. The commercial innovations developed during the plague crisis, combined with new approaches to credit, insurance, and risk management, contribute to the development of more sophisticated economic institutions. The plague's impact on European relationships with other world regions creates new patterns of cultural and economic exchange. The disruption of traditional trade networks encourages the development of new commercial relationships, while the demographic and economic changes within Europe alter its capacity for international engagement. Perhaps most significantly, the plague's long-term consequences demonstrate how demographic catastrophes can serve as catalysts for comprehensive social transformation. The Black Death doesn't simply kill people and then disappear. It fundamentally alters the trajectory of European civilization, creating conditions that make possible developments that would have been unthinkable under pre-plague social arrangements. You're witnessing not just recovery from demographic catastrophe, but the birth of a fundamentally different form of human civilization. The social institutions, economic relationships, and cultural practices that emerge from the plague's aftermath represent humanity's remarkable capacity to create new forms of organization and meaning, even after traditional structures have been completely shattered. The plague's legacy extends into the modern era, influencing everything from European political development to global economic systems. The demographic, social, and cultural changes initiated by the Black Death contribute to the emergence of the modern world system, demonstrating how even the most devastating historical catastrophes can become catalysts for human innovation and social progress. The long-term perspective reveals that the Black Death, despite its enormous human cost, ultimately contributes to developments that improve human welfare and expand human possibilities. The social mobility, technological innovation, and institutional development that emerge from plague-related disruptions help create the conditions for later improvements in living standards, political freedom, and cultural achievement that define the modern world. You're sitting in a quiet corner of the Bodleian Library at Oxford in the early 21st century, surrounded by medieval manuscripts and modern historical analyses, trying to piece together the global puzzle of the Black Death's ultimate impact on human civilization. The leather-bound chronicles and digitized databases before you tell the story. That's both more complex and more profound than medieval people could have imagined as they lived through humanity's greatest demographic catastrophe. Modern historical scholarship has revealed that the Black Death represents far more than a medical crisis. It's a fundamental turning point in human history that reshapes not just European civilization, but the entire trajectory of global development. You're examining evidence that show a bacterial infection that probably originated in the steppes of Central Asia. ultimately contributes to the emergence of the modern world system. The plague's global impact becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of world systems theory and comparative historical analysis. The demographic catastrophe that devastates Europe, Asia, and Africa in the 14th century creates a fundamental shift in the balance of global power, economic relationships, and cultural development that influences human civilization for centuries. Examine recent archaeological evidence from plague cemeteries across Europe, Asia, and Africa. It reveals the truly global scope of the pandemic. DNA analysis of plague victims from London to Beijing confirms that the same strain of Yersinia pestis spreads across continents, creating humanity's first truly global pandemic. This biological unity masks enormous diversity in how different societies experience and respond to the crisis. The plague's differential impact on various world regions creates new patterns of global development that persist into the modern era. Europe's eventual recovery and expansion, China's demographic resilience and technological innovation, the Islamic world's cultural adaptation and commercial reorganization, all of these developments trace their origins partly to plague-related changes in the 14th century. Here's a detail that reveals the plague's long-term global significance. The demographic and economic changes caused by the Black Death may have contributed to the Great Divergence, the process by which Western Europe eventually achieves technological and economic dominance over other world regions. The social and institutional innovations developed in response to plague-related challenges give European societies certain advantages in later global competition. Modern epidemiological research has revealed the plague's complex relationship with climate change, trade networks, and ecological systems. The Little Ice Age that begins in the 14th century, combined with the plague's demographic impact, creates environmental changes that affect everything from agricultural productivity to disease ecology. These environmental consequences influence human development patterns for centuries. You observe how modern genetic research has traced the plague, bacterium's evolution, and global spread with remarkable precision. Yersinia pestis strains from medieval plague victims show clear evolutionary relationships with modern plague bacteria, demonstrating the pathogen's remarkable stability and persistence across centuries. This genetic evidence confirms historical accounts while revealing new details about plague transmission and virulence. The plague's impact on global trade networks creates lasting changes in economic geography that influence modern commercial relationships. The disruption of Silk Road trade contributes to the eventual European development of maritime routes to Asia, while changes in Mediterranean commerce affect the balance of power between European and Islamic commercial centers. Modern demographic analysis reveals the plague's complex effects on global population patterns and migration flows. The uneven recovery from plague mortality creates population pressures and opportunities that influence everything from European colonial expansion to Asian internal migration patterns. These demographic changes contribute to the emergence of the modern global population distribution. The plague's influence on technological development becomes clearer when examined from a global perspective. The labor shortages created by plague mortality encouraged technological innovation in some regions while disrupting technological traditions in others. These differential effects on technological development contribute to later patterns of global technological leadership and dependency. You examine evidence showing how the plague's impact on religious and cultural systems contributes to later Developments including the Protestant Reformation, Islamic reform movements, and changes in Asian religious practices. The crisis of religious authority during the plague years creates conditions that make later religious and cultural transformations more likely and more successful. The plague's effect on political development contributes to the emergence of different forms of governmental organization across world regions. The centralization of authority in some European states, the administrative innovations in Chinese governance, and the political adaptations in Islamic societies all trace their origins partly to plague-related institutional changes. Modern economic historians have revealed how the plague's impact on labor relations and social structures contributes to the eventual emergence of different forms of capitalism and market organization across world regions. The wage labor systems that develop in post-plague Europe, the commercial innovations in Islamic societies, and the agricultural changes in Asian civilizations all influence later economic development patterns. Here's a fascinating modern insight. Computer modeling of plague transmission patterns suggests that the Black Death's global spread was even more extensive than historical records indicate. Some regions that lack written documentation of plague outbreaks show archaeological and genetic evidence of significant demographic disruption during the 14th century, suggesting that the pandemic's impact was truly global in scope. The plague's influence on gender relations and family structures creates lasting changes that affect social development across world regions. The increased economic opportunities for women during plague crises, combined with changes in inheritance patterns and family formation, contribute to gradual modifications in gender relationships that influence global social development for centuries. You observe how modern environmental historians have revealed the plague's complex ecological consequences. The demographic collapse in many regions leads to reforestation, changes in agricultural practices, and modifications in human-environment relationships that affect everything from climate patterns to biodiversity. These ecological changes influence human development possibilities for centuries. The plague's impact on knowledge systems and intellectual traditions creates lasting changes in how different societies approach learning, innovation, and cultural transmission. The disruption of traditional educational institutions encouraged new forms of knowledge production and dissemination that influence later intellectual developments across world regions. Modern medical research has revealed how the plague's evolutionary pressure on human populations may have influenced genetic diversity and disease resistance patterns that persist to the present day. Some human populations show genetic markers that may reflect adaptation to plague and other epidemic diseases, demonstrating the pathogen's lasting impact on human biological evolution. The plague's influence on urban development and settlement patterns creates lasting changes in global urbanization processes. The abandonment and reorganization of cities during plague outbreaks contributes to new forms of urban planning and development that influence later patterns of global urban growth and organization. You examine evidence showing how the plague's impact on international relations and diplomatic practices contributes to the development of modern international systems. The need for cooperation in managing epidemic disease, combined with changes in the balance of power between different regions, influences the emergence of new forms of international organization and cooperation. The plague's effect on cultural exchange and communication networks creates lasting changes in how ideas, technologies, and cultural practices spread across world regions. The disruption of traditional exchange networks encouraged the development of new forms of cultural transmission that influence later patterns of global cultural development. Modern psychological research has revealed the plague's lasting impact on collective memory, cultural trauma, and social resilience across different societies. The ways that different cultures process and remember plague experience influence their approaches to later crises and challenges, creating cultural patterns that persist for centuries. The plague's influence on legal systems and institutional development contributes to the emergence of different approaches to governance, property rights, and social organization across world regions. These institutional innovations influence later patterns of political and economic development that shape the modern world system. You observe how modern climate research has revealed the plague's complex relationship with environmental change and ecological systems. The demographic and agricultural changes caused by plague mortality interact with climate variations to create environmental conditions that influence human development possibilities for centuries. The plague's impact on migration patterns and population movements creates lasting changes in global demographic geography. The displacement of populations during plague outbreaks, combined with changes in settlement patterns and economic opportunities, influences later patterns of global migration and cultural exchange. Modern network analysis has revealed how the plague spread along trade and communication networks demonstrates the fundamental interconnectedness of medieval world systems. The pandemic's global transmission patterns provide evidence for much more extensive international connections than previously recognized, suggesting that globalization processes begin much earlier than traditionally assumed. Perhaps most significantly, modern historical analysis reveals that the Black Death represents a crucial turning point in the development of human civilization's capacity to respond to global challenges. The institutional innovations, technological developments, and cultural adaptations that emerge from plague experience contribute to humanity's growing ability to manage complex global problems. You're examining evidence that the plague's legacy extends into the contemporary era, influencing everything from modern public health systems to international cooperation mechanisms. The lessons learned from humanity's first global pandemic contribute to the development of institutions and practices that help manage later global challenges, including contemporary pandemic responses. The Black Death ultimately demonstrates both human vulnerability to global catastrophes and human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and recovery. The pandemic that kills an estimated 75 to 200 million people across 3 continents also catalyzes developments that improve human welfare, expand human possibilities, and strengthen human resilience in the face of future challenges. The plague's story reveals that even the most devastating historical catastrophes can become catalysts for positive human development when societies respond with innovation, cooperation, and determination to build better futures from the ashes of destruction. The medieval world that emerges from the Black Death is fundamentally different from what came before, more dynamic, more resilient, and better equipped to handle the challenges and opportunities of an interconnected world. You're witnessing, through historical analysis, how humanity's greatest demographic catastrophe ultimately contributes to the emergence of the modern world system, demonstrating the remarkable capacity of human societies to transform even the most devastating challenges into opportunities for growth, innovation, and progress. And there, in the quiet of that Oxford library, surrounded by the voices of the dead speaking through centuries-old manuscripts and the insights of modern scholarship, you close the final volume. The Black Death story is complete not just a tale of unprecedented mortality, but the origin story of the modern world itself, written in the language of human suffering, resilience, and ultimate triumph over seemingly insurmountable challenges. The plague that once stalked every street and knocked on every door has long since retreated into history, but its legacy lives on in every aspect of our contemporary world, in our institutions, our values, our capacity for both individual achievement and collective action. We are all, in some sense, children of the Black Death, inheritors of the world that emerged from humanity's darkest hour. Sleep well, knowing that even in our darkest moments, human ingenuity and resilience can forge new possibilities from the ashes of the old. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story of hope, proof that no catastrophe, however devastating, can permanently defeat the human spirit's capacity to adapt, innovate, and build better futures for generations yet to come.